Welcome to medieval justice, a thrilling combination of superstition, guesswork, creative punishment, and vibes-based sentencing. In a time before rights, legal codes, or even the concept that maybe torturing someone isn't the best way to get the truth, justice was less about fairness and more about who you were, what you owned, and whether or not the village priest liked you. Hello travelers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with the most important legal question of the Middle Ages. What even counts as a crime? The answer is everything. Are you stealing a chicken? That's theft. Are you accused of stealing a chicken? Still theft. Are you a person accused of having thoughts? Possibly witchcraft. Are you a peasant who insulted a noble's mustache? Congratulations. You've committed seditious mockery. A real thing. Penalty. Lose your tongue or your life, or both. In that order. And don't even think about skipping church. That could get you fined, shamed, or excommunicated. Which, back then, was like getting cancelled by both the Pope and your entire village. Medieval society was powered by hierarchy, divine fear, and an ongoing suspicion that your neighbour might be hiding goats in his shed again. But here's the real kicker. Laws were not standardized. If you lived in a different village, or even just one town over, you might be held to completely different rules. Every region had its own bonus content. A crime in one town might be ignored in another, and vice versa. One lord might be lenient. Another might wake up grumpy and sentence you to a week in the stocks for sneezing too loud. Justice was so deeply local that the word custom basically was the law. You didn't just break a law, you broke a tradition, and that was somehow worse. Well, we've always burned people who whistle after sunset. It's just how we do things around here. So, who actually enforced these whimsical, often terrifying rules? Spoiler, it wasn't a trained legal body. There were no professional police, no law degrees, and definitely no court-appointed defense attorneys. If you were accused of a crime, the person deciding your fate could be a nobleman with a sword and zero chill, a local priest with strong opinions about your sins, a group of villagers who once saw you spit during Lent, or the town's reeve, a guy whose qualifications included owns a hat and isn't currently drunk. And if you were lucky, really lucky, there might be a judge sent by the king. But judge in the Middle Ages often meant a man who thought bathing was dangerous and believed left-handedness was a sign of the devil. He may have also dabbled in alchemy. Your chances were slim. Now, let's talk about evidence. You know, that thing courts today use to prove guilt or innocence. Medieval courts had a different idea. Instead of evidence, they relied on oaths, reputation, and the occasional chicken bone omen. You might be told to bring oath helpers, literally people who would swear on your behalf. If you could gather a posse of upstanding villagers to say, yes, this man does not stab people for fun, then hey, you might just walk free. But if your only friends were also slightly stabby, you were in trouble. And heaven forbid, if you were a stranger. Outsiders were guilty by default. The medieval legal system didn't trust people it didn't know, and sometimes even the people it did know. Everyone was suspicious, which is what happens when the Black Death, Viking raids, and the devil are all considered equally likely daily events. Also worth noting, the same crime could have very different outcomes depending on your social status. If you were a noble and you murdered someone, you might pay a fine. If you were a peasant and you stole a loaf of bread, you might be hanged. In short, rich people had loopholes, poor people had ropes. And this wasn't a bug in the system. This was the system. Justice was a performance, a ritual, and sometimes an actual festival. You weren't just on trial, you were on stage. The community would gather, snacks in hand, waiting to see if you'd get flogged, fined, or forced to carry a heavy stone up a hill, while everyone sang hymns. It was justice meets pageantry, with a strong chance of public humiliation. So to recap, crimes were anything that upset the local mood. Laws were a regional personality test. Evidence was optional, but a solid beard could help. And the outcome? Well, let's just say that if logic was invited to the courtroom, it usually left halfway through, sobbing quietly. This was medieval justice, where fairness was a rumor, Bias was standard procedure, and your best legal strategy was either bribery or divine intervention. So you've been accused of stealing a sheep, or cursing your neighbour's turnips, or maybe just looking a little too smug after someone's well dried up. It's medieval times, so there's no CCTV, no fingerprints, and no let's review the evidence. There's only one logical next step: ask God. Welcome to the thrilling world of trial by ordeal, where guilt or innocence is determined not by proof, but by how well your body handles extreme pain. Because nothing screams fair legal process like dunking someone in boiling water and calling it a moral compass. This sacred system was built on the belief that God wouldn't let an innocent person suffer unjustly. Which sounds nice, until you realize that the way God delivered this divine thumbs up was by seeing whether you bled too much, blistered too badly, or floated like a particularly sinful cork. Let's break down your options, shall we? The ordeal of hot iron. Who needs nerves? Anyway, this was the medieval equivalent of a polygraph. If the polygraph was a red-hot poker, and everyone clapped when you screamed. In this ordeal, the accused was required to carry a glowing hot iron bar over a certain distance, usually around 3 paces. Then the wound was bandaged and inspected 3 days later. If your hand had healed well, clearly innocent. If it festered or got infected, which by medieval standards was roughly 100% of the time, you were guilty. Yes, that's right. The entire system hinged on how well your body fought off sepsis, which makes you wonder how many court cases were won by people who just happened to have good circulation. Your defense strategy: don't get third-degree burns. The ordeal of boiling water, finger soup edition. In another charming variety, you'd plunge your hand into a cauldron of boiling water and retrieve a small object, usually a pebble or a ring, from the bottom. Now if you're thinking, hey, that sounds like it would cause horrific blistering and permanent damage, congratulations, you are smarter than everyone involved in the process. Once again, they'd bandage the hand and check back in a few days. If the wound looked good, you were free to go. If it looked like you'd stirred a medieval stew with your bare hand, guilty. It's hard to believe anyone could walk away from this ordeal, literally or figuratively. But people asked for this. Sometimes volunteered for it, because the only thing scarier than grabbing a ring from boiling water was what might happen if you refused. And yes, people did train for these ordeals. Some would callous their hands or use ointments ahead of time to fake faster healing. So it became not just a test of faith, but a full contact sport of medieval courtroom hacks. The ordeal by fire. Hot-footed to hell. This one took it up a notch. Instead of just touching hot metal, you might be required to walk over red-hot plowshares, bare feet only, please, and hope that divine justice manifested itself in the form of unburned souls. If your feet blistered up like a cursed pizza crust, guilty. If they stayed smooth and unsinged, innocent, or possibly an undercover dragon. Again, medieval logic. Surely God will intervene if we hurt this person hard enough. A bit like testing your toaster by shoving your entire face into it. The ordeal by water. The witchy whirlpool of justice. And now, perhaps the most famous of them all, trial by cold water. You'd be tied up and tossed into a river or lake. If you floated, the belief was that the water, being pure and holy, had rejected you. Therefore, you were guilty. If you sank, the water had accepted you as pure, but sadly, you were now purely dead. In short, float equals witch, sink equals innocent. But enjoy the afterlife. In some cases, people were fished out in time, but you had to hope the town dunkmaster had a good sense of timing and wasn't distracted by a goose or some other local emergency. It was less about the truth and more about medieval spectacle. Because let's face it, nothing drew a crowd like watching your neighbour tied up and chucked into a pond while a priest yelled Latin at the sky. At its core, trial by ordeal wasn't just superstition. It was ritualized, faith-based torture. It made the legal system look decisive, theatrical, and moral. After all, who can argue with God? And sure, people sometimes walked away unburned or unsunk. Whether that was luck, rigging, or a miracle remains up for debate. But in most cases, the ordeal was less about finding the truth and more about scaring people into submission, confession, or community-approved punishment. Let's not forget, these ordeals were public. Spectators came out like it was market day. Ah yes, I'll have 3 turnips, a loaf of rye, and front row seats. to see Gregory plunge his hand into a boiling pot to prove he didn't steal Marjorie's goat. If that's justice, then your best legal advisor is a bucket of aloe and a really good swimming coach. In modern courtrooms, you've got judges in black robes, juries of your peers, defense attorneys arguing on your behalf, and a giant gavel that's mostly there for dramatic effect. But in the medieval era, let's just say you were more likely to find a judge with mud on his boots, a sword on his hip, and the legal knowledge of a slightly literate sheep. Because when it came to medieval justice, the question wasn't, what does the law say? It was, who owns the land you're standing on? And the answer to that question decided everything, from whether you got a fair trial to whether you left court with both ears still attached. Let's start with the lords, barons and nobles, the people who owned basically everything: the land, the farms, the mills, the cows, and yes, even the right to hand out justice like it was part of the dinner menu. If you committed a crime on a noble's land, you'd be judged by that noble. And if that sounds like a conflict of interest, you're absolutely right. But medieval folks didn't see it that way. Justice wasn't about fairness. It was about power, property, and making sure no peasants got too comfortable. Imagine being tried by a man who collected taxes, ran the local economy, led the military, and once declared war on the next village over because their cheese was smug. Now imagine him deciding whether you live or die based on how annoyed he is that day. No pressure. These noblemen were often responsible for hosting manorial courts, which met at irregular intervals, usually in a dusty barn, a church, or under the largest tree available. The lord might sit on an actual chair, while the rest of you stood in mud and judgment. There were no legal textbooks, just local customs, inherited feuds, and a strong belief that whoever owned the biggest hat knew best. And because these lords usually had complete authority over their lands, they could decide everything from how many sheep you could own to whether your son was allowed to marry the miller's daughter. And if you were caught breaking one of the lord's dozens of arbitrary rules, that same lord would happily fine you for it, which, conveniently, sent money straight back into his pocket. It was justice, yes, but also a brilliant side hustle. If you were lucky or unlucky enough to commit a crime that fell under church jurisdiction, your judge might be a bishop, abbot or clergyman, someone who had memorized scripture, knew Latin, and believed sin was the root of all illness, including hiccups. Church courts were technically meant to deal with religious offenses, heresy, blasphemy, adultery, and the occasional winking too aggressively during communion. But they often got involved in civil disputes too, because the church had power, money, and a deep need to supervise your personal life. And while these trials were theoretically more forgiving, favoring penance over punishment, the outcomes depended heavily on how pious you looked, and how well you could fake a Latin prayer under pressure. Bonus points if you cried at the right moment. But again, fairness wasn't a requirement. These courts had no juries, just a man in a robe who thought leprosy might be caused by impure thoughts, and was very confident in his decision-making. Now let's not forget the village courts, where things really got casual. In smaller towns and manors, justice was often a communal affair. Picture a bunch of villagers standing around a tree, all arguing about whether Gregor really stole Martha's chicken or just borrowed it indefinitely. Sometimes, a local official called the reeve would preside. The reeve wasn't chosen for his legal skill. He was often just the guy with the most time on his hands and the ability to shout the loudest. He might also be the town drunk, or the baker, or both. In these cases, jury just meant a few people from the village who probably didn't hate you unless you owed them a pig. Trials would be fast, sentences would be creative, and the only record keeping was whoever remembered what happened last time someone got caught stealing onions. If you were a peasant, a woman, a foreigner, or just someone who looked weird, your chances of a fair trial were microscopic. You weren't innocent until proven guilty. You were guilty until someone more powerful got bored. A fair trial, as long as you weren't poor, foreign, or breathing wrong. The legal system was essentially a pyramid scheme, where those at the top made the rules, broke them freely, and punished those below for the same crimes. The law was more of a suggestion, unless you were nobility, in which case it was more like a party trick. So to sum it up, if you committed a crime, your judge was probably your landlord. If the church was involved, hope you brushed up on your psalms. And if your case made it to the village court, Hope your neighbor isn't still mad about that one time you accidentally let your cow wander into his garden. Because in the world of medieval justice, it wasn't about what you did, it was about who got to say you did it. Imagine a medieval town, quiet, muddy, and mostly preoccupied with not starving. Suddenly, you hear hoofbeats in the distance. Is it bandits? A caravan? The return of that one knight who talks too much? Nope, it's the royal justices, and they've rolled into town like a grim circus on horseback, ready to turn your sleepy village into an impromptu courtroom, execution ground, and moral lesson all in one. Welcome to the Eyre, pronounced like Eyre, but heavier with doom. These were the travelling royal courts, a legal innovation from the 12th century that brought the king's law straight to the people, or, more accurately, down upon the people like a boulder of bureaucracy and blood. What was an heir? The Eyre was essentially a legal roadshow. The king would appoint groups of royal judges, educated, stern and occasionally literate, to ride from shire to shire, dispensing justice on behalf of the crown. Think of them as the Amazon Prime of medieval law, delayed, unpredictable, and often arriving with a sentence you didn't ask for. These judges didn't travel light. They came with clerks, scribes, guards, and a mobile archive of documents called the rolls, an intimidating pile of parchment that proved they meant business. When the Eyre rolled into town, they brought the full force of royal authority, and often a backlog of criminal cases that had been piling up like unswept horse manure. Their goal, clear the docket, make examples, and remind everyone that yes, the king still exists, and he's watching. The Eyres were not interested in nuance. These judges had a lot of ground to cover, and not much time to do it. They might only visit a town once every 7 years, so when they showed up, they had hundreds of cases to settle, fast. And by settle we mean judge, sentence, and occasionally hang people before lunchtime. Justice was delivered with the efficiency of a medieval food truck, just with more hangings. Everything was done publicly. The townsfolk gathered in the square, eager to see whose crimes had finally caught up to them, and who had been dragged in just because someone didn't like their face. The court might sit for days or weeks, but the energy was always the same, tense, theatrical, and a little bloodthirsty. You didn't hire a lawyer, you just showed up, sweaty and terrified, hoping your goat-related misunderstanding didn't end with a rope. Let's be clear, the Eyres were not just about justice, they were about money. Every trial came with court fees, fines, and payments for mercy. Yes, you could literally buy royal forgiveness, like some grim VIP pass. Villagers were even expected to pay for the privilege of being judged. Hosting an Eyre meant you were billed for housing the judges, feeding them, and providing enough beer to keep their moods above burn everything. And if your town didn't have many criminals, tough luck. The crown still wanted revenue, so minor offences, trespassing, hunting a deer without permission, looking suspicious on a Tuesday, was suddenly bumped up the priority list. The goal was not just to correct behaviour, but to financially squeeze every village dry, one petty infraction at a time. And of course, no Eyre visit was complete without a healthy display of public execution. This wasn't just punishment, it was performance. Condemned criminals were often held until the judges arrived, meaning the village had a little inventory of misery ready to go. Once judged, they were marched to the gallows or execution site, often the same square where justice had been delivered an hour earlier. These executions were meant to demonstrate the strength of the king's justice, and boy did they. People were hanged, beheaded, or mutilated with theatrical flair. It wasn't enough for justice to be served, it had to be seen. If you heard hoofbeats, it was either the king's men or your last chance to flee. While many medieval legal systems relied on shouting and gut feelings, the Eyres were bureaucratic machines. Every sentence, fine, and bribe, payment, was recorded on parchment rolls, stored for future reference. In fact, some of the oldest surviving legal documents from medieval England come from Eyre records. These scribes documented every offence, even absurd ones like allowed swine to wander into church or failed to properly fence cabbage patch. Yes, even the cabbage crimes made the rolls. The Eyres weren't just about clearing cases, they were about reminding everyone that the king's justice reigned supreme. It didn't matter how remote your village was, no one was beyond reach. Whether you were a baker, a beggar, or a minor noble with questionable sheep-herding habits, The Eyre could roll in at any time and turn your life into a courtroom drama with zero commercial breaks. In the modern world, crimes are fairly predictable. Theft, fraud, maybe a tax scandal, if you're fancy. But in the Middle Ages, anything could be a crime, especially if it annoyed your local lord, conflicted with church dogma, or involved your neighbour's chicken, acting suspicious. This was a time when gossiping could land you in court. Baking small bread was considered fraud, and wearing fancy shoes above your social rank was basically a declaration of war against the class system. Because in medieval times, justice wasn't just about what you did, it was about who you offended. And when it came to punishment, oh, they got creative. Let's begin with something universal. Stealing food. Say you're hungry. Starving even. You snatch a crusty old loaf of barley bread from the market and run. Boom. You've just committed grand theft carbohydrate. The penalty could be mutilation, branding, a public whipping, or if the Lord was having a particularly bad day, death. That's right. In a society where half the population was perpetually underfed, stealing bread could cost you your life. Now contrast that with the noble who accidentally pillaged an entire village because they didn't bow fast enough. His punishment, a mild scolding, a new estate, and maybe a promotion. Steal a loaf of bread, lose your hand. Steal a kingdom, congratulations, your majesty. Yes, gossiping was a criminal offence. If you spread rumours, especially about someone of higher status, you could be fined, flogged, or subjected to a punishment known as the scold's bridle. What was the scold's bridle, you ask? Well, it was basically a metal cage strapped to your head with a little iron plate that went in your mouth to prevent you from speaking. It was like a medieval muzzle for people who talked too much. Bonus humiliation points if it had bells on it, so everyone knew where you were at all times. And just to be clear, this was usually reserved for women, because of course it was. Believe it or not, wearing the wrong shoes could get you punished. Certain shoe styles were reserved for certain classes. If you were a peasant wearing long-pointed Krakow shoes, which screamed wealthy idiot, you might be fined or whipped for social impersonation. The medieval logic was simple. Your clothes had to reflect your social station. You couldn't dress above your class, because that would create chaos. After all, how would anyone know how to judge you at a glance? God forbid, a serf look fabulous. It's the only justice system where a wardrobe malfunction could lead to flogging. Let's say your pig escapes and eats your neighbour's grain. That's not just whoopsie, my bacon wandered. It's a criminal offence. You could be fined or forced to pay restitution in the form of grain, labour, or another pig. But in some truly bizarre cases, the animal itself was put on trial. The pig might be tried for murder, sentenced in court, and publicly executed. Full ceremony, robed judges, witnesses, the whole barnyard legal process. This wasn't just punishment, it was a message to the community. No one is above the law, not even your breakfast. One of the favourite punishments across medieval Europe was public humiliation. Stocks and pillories weren't just physical restraints, they were entertainment. You'd be locked in, arms and head sticking out, and the townspeople could gather around to laugh, yell, and throw things at you. And oh, did they throw things. Rotten vegetables, spoiled eggs, mud, maybe a fish that had been dead for 4 days. It was like Yelp reviews, but messier and more painful. They didn't believe in therapy, just stocks and a crowd with tomatoes. Punishments like this were popular because they were cheap, dramatic, and social. They shamed the criminal, bonded the community, and gave the villagers a fun outing between plagues. Many punishments were designed to be permanent reminders of your crimes. Thieves might be branded on the forehead or hand with a hot iron. A repeat offender could have an ear cut off, or even a nose removed. It was brutal, but efficient. That way, everyone knew who you were and what you'd done just by looking at your face. Who needs criminal records when you have a literal scarlet letter? Branding wasn't just punishment, it was branding strategy. There was even a punishment called the ducking stool, mostly for women accused of being too loud, rude, or scandalous. They'd be strapped to a wooden seat and dunked into a river repeatedly. If they didn't drown, excellent. If they did, well, oops. Other crimes included swearing in public, fined or whipped, skipping church penance or stocks, failing to fence your cabbage garden because someone might steal the cabbage and then you'd be to blame. There were even laws against being unmarried for too long, especially for women. Because clearly, being single was a threat to the moral fabric of society, and maybe it made the cabbage nervous. So in medieval times, crime and punishment wasn't about fairness. It was about order, obedience, and making an example out of you in the loudest, messiest way possible. Whether you stole, talked too much, or just wore really cool shoes, there was a punishment with your name on it, and probably a crowd to cheer it on. Now welcome to the weirdest corner of medieval justice. Animal trials. A very real, well-documented phenomenon where animals were put on trial just like humans, with witnesses, court clerks, judges, defense attorneys, and sometimes tiny chairs. Let's start with the most famous case. A pig in 14th century France who was put on trial for murder. According to historical records, the pig had wandered into a house, attacked a child, and killed him, which admittedly is horrifying. But instead of simply putting the pig down, the townspeople did the logical thing, put the pig on trial. Like a human, it had a full hearing. A judge was appointed, witnesses were called, evidence was presented, presumably a very guilty-looking pig, and maybe some ominous oinks, and in the end, the pig was found guilty of homicide and sentenced to death by hanging. They even dressed the pig in human clothes for the execution, because medieval justice wasn't going to miss out on the theatrical finale. This was more than justice. This was an event. You might be wondering, okay, pigs are big, but did they really put smaller animals on trial too? Oh yes. Let's talk rats. In 16th century France, a group of rats was accused of destroying a barley crop. They were summoned to appear in court, which, shockingly, they did not. But here's where it gets amazing. Their court-appointed defense attorney argued they had a good reason for skipping the hearing. The rats, he claimed, couldn't attend because the journey was long and dangerous. The cats along the way posed a serious risk, and the rats hadn't been properly summoned to each individual home, as was their legal right. The court considered this argument seriously. They delayed the trial to give the rats more time. It's like a Tom and Jerry episode, written by Kafka. Justice was blind, and apparently really bad at species recognition. Pigs and rats weren't the only ones facing the wrath of medieval law. Entire trials were held for insects, especially when they caused crop failures. Locusts, weevils, and caterpillars were often accused of destruction and ordered to leave fields or face legal consequences, because obviously, that's how insect communication works. Some trials even involved bishops or priests, who would serve these bugs with formal notices to appear in court or vacate a territory. If the bugs didn't comply, which, spoiler alert, they never did, the court might issue a sentence of excommunication. Imagine it, Your Honour, the beetles refuse to vacate the vineyard, then we shall banish them in the name of the Lord. Suddenly, a cloud of bugs is now persona non grata. That'll show them. Horses, cows, goats, and even donkeys were also brought to trial for everything from kicking their owners to trespassing. In many cases, they were tried under the exact same laws as people. In 1474, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, was put on trial for laying an egg. Why? Because everyone knew roosters weren't supposed to lay eggs, and if they did, it meant witchcraft. So naturally, the chicken was executed for sorcery. Sometimes animals were even tortured for confessions. You read that right. Tortured, as if a sheep would suddenly crack under pressure and admit to conspiracy. As absurd as it sounds, animal trials weren't just medieval people being quirky. They actually had a logic, a very warped one, but logic nonetheless. In their worldview, animals had moral agency. Everything that caused harm, even unintentionally, had to be dealt with publicly, and justice wasn't just punishment. It was theatrical, religious, and symbolic. These trials served as moral lessons to the community. They dramatized the line between good and evil, order and chaos, even if that meant making a goose the scapegoat for divine wrath. Also, let's be honest, they made for excellent local gossip. Did you hear the donkey's trial starts Monday? They say he kicked Father Thomas right in the holy relics. So yes, the Middle Ages gave us castles, cathedrals, and crusades, but they also gave us a criminal justice system that once sentenced a beetle to exile. To them, it wasn't ridiculous, it was righteous. It was about maintaining order, making a show of justice, and reminding everyone, humans and animals alike, that someone was always watching, even if that someone was the town bailiff, dragging a chicken into court. Long before the invention of Netflix, TikTok or documentaries with ominous piano music. People got their drama live and local. And by drama we mean executions, the original reality TV, complete with high-stakes dramatic finales and crowds who showed up early to get a good seat. If you lived in medieval Europe and heard someone shout, "They're hanging the baker at noon," your natural response was probably, "Better grab the kids and the meat pies. This is going to be amazing." Public executions weren't just about punishing criminals, they were events, rituals, and morality plays rolled into one. You didn't just kill someone, you made a point, served some trauma, and made sure the villagers would remember not to steal a chicken ever again. Let's start with the headliners. Execution methods varied depending on your crime, your status, and how creative the authorities felt that day. Beheading was reserved for the noble and the notable. You had to be someone important to have your head off. If you were lucky, the executioner was skilled, and it was over in one clean swing. If not, well, let's just say your final moments would be extended. Burning at the stake was for heretics, witches, and people the church really wanted to make an example of. Fire wasn't just punishment, it was symbolic purification. Also, it was loud, smoky, and impossible to ignore. That's what we call maximum visibility execution marketing. And for a sprinkle of horror drawing and quartering, this involved being hanged, but not to death, disemboweled, and then pulled apart by horses. This was reserved for traitors and enemies of the crown. In other words, not your average goat thief. Executions were carefully choreographed. The condemned often gave a final speech, a confession, a plea, or a dramatic monologue. People came from miles around to hear it. The bigger the sin, the bigger the crowd. Sometimes a priest was there to help the soul transition to the next life. Sometimes there was a town crier narrating the whole thing, and sometimes the executioner had his own fan base, especially if he was known for getting the job done clean. The whole thing was part theatre, part sermon, part community potluck. And yes, people really did bring snacks. Vendors set up stalls selling hot pies, ale, and fruit. For many, this was the biggest social event of the month. It wasn't just about punishment. It was communal bonding through horror. Nothing brings a village together like shared trauma and hot cider. It might sound hard to hear, but these events were considered family-friendly. Parents brought children along, not in spite of the horror, but because of it. The thinking went, if little Jeffrey sees what happens to pickpockets, he won't become one. Because clearly, nothing encourages childhood obedience like watching a man be publicly disemboweled while holding a meat skewer. There was no such thing as shielding children from the darkness of life. In medieval society, you faced the consequences up close, ideally while sharing a smoked sausage with your neighbor. Executioners were often feared, hated, or at best, weirdly respected. They weren't just hired muscle, they were professionals with specific tools, techniques, and a surprising amount of flair. Many wore hoods or masks, not to look scary, but to hide their identity. Being the guy who kills people for a living didn't win you many dinner invites. Fun fact: some executioners inherited the role from their fathers, others were forced into it as punishment for their own crimes, which means your executioner might have been a reformed horse thief, trying to make good by lopping off heads with flair and accuracy. The job paid well, but the social isolation was brutal. Some towns forced the executioner to live outside the walls, which feels like a pretty big overreaction for someone who's just doing his job. Public executions weren't just about killing people, they were about control, a reminder that the king, the lord, or the church had power over your body and soul. It was a performance of authority. By staging the punishment so dramatically, leaders hoped to imprint the law into every villager's brain. You didn't need to read, you just needed to see. If someone was caught stealing a horse, they might not get a private trial and a quiet sentence. No, they'd get a parade to the gallows, a crowd of villagers watching, and maybe even a musician playing something ominous on a lute. Because fear, as it turns out, is best served with a side of public shaming and live entertainment. If medieval justice was a chaotic stew of hot irons, public hangings, and angry villagers throwing turnips, then church courts were the slightly quieter, robe-clad cousin who showed up and said, "Let's settle this with prayer and crushing guilt." Because once the church stepped into the legal arena, the punishments didn't always involve whips or gallows. Sometimes they involved kneeling for hours, fasting until you hallucinated saints, or reciting the Lord's Prayer until your lips fell off. Welcome to Canon law, where you might not lose your head, but you definitely lose sleep, self-respect, and probably the ability to sit comfortably after hours of penitential kneeling on stone floors. Church courts weren't held in town squares or muddy fields. They took place in churches, monasteries, and cloisters, sacred spaces where justice wore a robe, quoted scripture, and handed out spiritual consequences with the same intensity the royal court handed out beheadings. These courts dealt with moral offences, adultery, blasphemy, drunkenness, and heresy, clergy crimes. Because yes, even monks misbehaved. Spiritual matters like excommunication or violating religious vows, and occasionally bizarre things like accusing a nun of owning too many shoes. The focus wasn't always punishment. It was purification of the soul. But don't get too cozy. Church court might not kill you, but it could ruin your reputation, drain your wallet, and guilt-trip you into next week. The setup was similar to secular courts. You had judges, usually bishops or priests, clerks, witnesses, and sometimes even defense statements. But the vibe was very different. There was Latin chanting, candlelight, maybe incense, and always the sense that God was watching and deeply disappointed. If found guilty, you weren't shackled or branded. Instead, the court might assign public penance, like walking barefoot through the village, while wearing a sign that read sinner, fasting no food, except maybe some boiled oats and regret. Pilgrimage, because nothing says punishment like walking 500 miles with blisters and lice. Or the classic, say 100 prayers and feel very bad about yourself. Yes, that was your actual punishment. Divine justice wasn't just about rules, it was about emotionally wrecking you until you repented out loud, preferably with tears. Sin now, confess later. Medieval version of a free trial. Forget torture chambers. The church preferred mental torment. You were expected to feel such overwhelming sorrow for your sins that you voluntarily accepted punishment. And if you didn't feel guilty enough, the church had ways of helping. A typical priest might deliver a fire and brimstone monologue tailored to your specific sins. Committed adultery? Prepare for a sermon filled with biblical doom, comparisons to Satan, and visuals involving lakes of fire and eternal screaming. Sometimes they made you stand during Mass for hours, arms raised, while everyone around you watched and judged silently. You'd basically get excommunicated by side-eye. One of the quirks of church justice was the benefit of clergy, a loophole that let people avoid secular punishment if they could prove they were part of the clergy. At first, this only applied to actual monks, priests, and deacons, but over time it expanded to anyone who could read a passage from the Bible in Latin. So if you could stumble your way through Psalm 51, congratulations, you were spiritually upgraded and now outside the king's jurisdiction. This led to some delightful absurdities: hardened criminals memorizing Latin verses to dodge hangings, courts testing criminals with the neck verse, a specific Bible line every educated person knew by heart, judges squinting suspiciously while bandits faked divine literacy. And since literacy was rare, this perk mostly helped wealthy, educated men. If you were a poor peasant, enjoy the stocks and the cabbage barrage. The one area where church courts did get terrifyingly intense was heresy, questioning the teachings of the church, spreading unauthorized ideas, translating the Bible into something people could understand. That wasn't just a disagreement. That was spiritual treason. The church took heresy personally, and heretics were often handed over to secular courts for execution, usually by burning, because again, purification by fire. And also fear, lots and lots of fear. This wasn't just about punishing wrong belief. It was about making sure everyone in the village knew what happened to the guy who started asking too many questions. Church courts weren't just a parallel system, they were a rival power structure. Sometimes more powerful than the king's own law, they shaped moral behavior, reinforced religious control, and created a culture of internal surveillance, where your neighbor might report you for not bowing deeply enough during communion. And unlike secular justice, which was about law and land, church justice was about souls, which meant even after you did your penance, you still worried about damnation. So yes, church justice was quieter, cleaner, and technically more forgiving. But if you've ever felt Catholic guilt, just for not texting someone back, multiply that by 1,000, and add a bishop with a great beard. In medieval justice, there were many ways to determine guilt: divine ordeals, pious penance, maybe a public trial if you were lucky. But when all else failed, or when someone just looked too suspicious, officials had a simple philosophy: let's just ask them, with metal. Welcome to the iron-scented, scream-filled world of medieval torture, where evidence was optional, guilt was assumed, and confession usually meant screaming out anything just to make the agony stop. Torture wasn't just used to punish, it was used to interrogate. The problem: when you're dangling upside down with your joints dislocating, you'll confess to anything. Murder? Witchcraft? The extinction of the dinosaurs? Just say the word, and they'll write it down. In theory, torture was meant to extract truth from suspects. The logic went like this: innocent people have nothing to fear. Guilty people will crack under pain. Therefore, torture will bring out justice. This, of course, completely ignores human biology, psychology, and basic decency. But to the medieval mind, pain was clarifying. If God allowed you to survive torture without confessing, maybe you were innocent. But if you screamed out names and begged for death, well, thanks for your honesty. So yes, they believed in open dialogue, as long as your limbs were open too. Let's take a guided tour through the medieval torture chamber, where every piece of equipment had one job: make you talk, or at least scream in multiple languages. The Rackar, the celebrity of the torture world. You're tied down at the wrists and ankles, and slowly stretched like human taffy. Muscles tear, joints pop, and eventually your body begins to look like spaghetti with regrets. This method was beloved for its slow burn pain, dramatic sound effects, and the fact that eventually everyone confessed, even if they didn't know what they were confessing to. Thumbscrews less flashy, more portable. Your thumbs or fingers are placed between two metal plates and slowly crushed. It's torture on a micro scale, perfect for interrogating witches, spies, or anyone who borrowed your plow and never returned it. Fun fact, they made deluxe thumbscrews with spikes inside, because if you're going to crush someone's digits, you may as well get creative. Water torture, not the spa kind. Variations of this included the water cure, where the victim is force-fed massive amounts of water until their stomach swells painfully or worse. Simulated drowning, what we now call waterboarding. A cloth over the face, water poured in small amounts, the sensation of drowning, and a guaranteed confession in under 3 minutes, or your torture's free. The Iron Maiden, possibly apocryphal, but infamous anyway. Imagine a human-shaped coffin, lined with iron spikes. You're placed inside and slowly closed in. The spikes don't kill immediately, just pierce soft tissue. This one may have been more legend than reality, but it perfectly captured the vibe of medieval interrogation. Poetic, theatrical, and terrifyingly unnecessary. Once a confession was obtained, no matter how, it was often recorded as gospel truth. You couldn't recant later, even if your arms were in slings and your kneecaps had relocated to your elbows. False confessions were rampant. People would admit to crimes they didn't commit, implicate innocent neighbors, and invent entire heretic cults just to end the pain. This led to the torture spiral problem. One tortured person named 5 others, who were then arrested and tortured, who named 5 more. And suddenly you've got a full village of heretics, witches, or conspirators, all created by agony-based storytelling. Contrary to popular belief, torture wasn't always conducted in dark dungeons by rogue sadists. In many kingdoms, it was part of the legal system. In places like the Holy Roman Empire and Inquisition-era Spain, torture was codified in law, with official protocols and polite documentation. Some courts even required half-proof, basically weak evidence, before resorting to torture. But this proof could be as little as an anonymous rumor or a dream someone had involving goats. No, really. In theory, torture had rules. You couldn't cause permanent injury, and you had to stop once the person confessed. In practice, these rules were as flexible as your shoulder joints. After 30 minutes on the rack, torture wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Authorities believed pain purified the soul. If someone confessed, they could be forgiven. If they didn't, well, they were obviously hiding something and deserved worse. This gave torture a moral halo effect, a horrifying belief that causing suffering was a righteous act. Interrogators weren't just doing their job, they were, in their eyes, saving your soul, one broken rib at a time. In the end, torture wasn't about truth. It was about control. Fear kept the population obedient. The sight or sound of someone being stretched, smashed or waterboarded in a nearby tower sent a powerful message. Speak carefully, confess quickly, and never look suspicious near a rack. After centuries of burning, boiling, stretching, praying, and wildly guessing who was guilty based on how they floated, medieval Europe eventually had a collective epiphany. Wait a second, maybe this isn't the best system. It took time, a lot of time, and not without resistance. But slowly, painfully, and with many a side-eyed executioner forced into early retirement, Europe began to upgrade its justice system from divine roulette to something slightly more rational. Welcome to the slow, clunky, and occasionally shocking evolution from trial by ordeal to trial by evidence. The first big shift came when the church, yes, the same institution that once excommunicated grasshoppers, started to have second thoughts about burning people for justice. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council banned clergy from participating in ordeals. No more blessing hot irons, boiling pots, or dunking stools. And since the church had a monopoly on sacred rituals, this effectively shut the ordeal party down. Why? Because even the church had started to worry that relying on boiling water to decide truth might not be ideal. There's progress for you. They finally realized that burning people wasn't the best way to determine truth. Progress. With ordeals out of the picture, courts had to find new ways to determine guilt. Ways that didn't involve third-degree burns or holy guesswork. As ordeals died out, a new system began to emerge. Trial by jury. Yes, that jury. The one with 12 people who sit, frown, and pretend they aren't judging your haircut while listening to testimony. In 12th century England, under King Henry II, juries began replacing divine judgment. At first, juries weren't impartial. Oh no. They were people from your village who already knew you and had opinions. Lots of them. In fact, early jurors were more like neighborhood gossip panels than legal analysts, but over time they evolved into the impartial finders of fact we mostly trust today. This was a monumental shift. Instead of asking God, we started asking each other. Was it perfect? No, but it beat being dunked in a river while tied to a chair. Let's give a standing ovation to 1215 again. Not just for ending ordeals, but also for the Magna Carta, which is Latin for, okay, fine, kings have to follow some rules. When English barons got tired of King John behaving like an overcooked turkey with a crown, they forced him to sign this foundational document. Among its many revolutionary ideas was this gem: no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. Translation: you need a trial, and not the boiling waters kind. The Magna Carta wasn't a perfect blueprint for justice. Serfs were still out of luck, but it was the first major statement that law should be consistent, transparent, and not made up on the spot by a sweaty noble with a grudge. As the legal system got more complex, people realized they needed help navigating it. Thus, lawyers were born. Initially, lawyers were just clergy or well-read nobles who could understand Latin and spin a good yarn. But over time, professional legal roles were formalized. There were people who defended, prosecuted, and judged cases based on laws written down in actual books. A revolutionary idea in a world where justice once meant Lord Gerald said so. Now, you might not like lawyers, but given the choice between a guy in a hood waving a branding iron and a guy in robes quoting the Magna Carta, you'd probably take the legalese and passive aggression over the iron every time. One of the biggest upgrades in the medieval to modern transition was the radical notion that evidence should be used to determine guilt. Yes, instead of visions, water temperatures, or town gossip, courts began requiring witnesses, documents, and physical proof. This didn't happen overnight, of course. Even in the 1600s, people were still being executed for witchcraft based on dream testimony and suspicious cheese mold. But the trend was clear. Justice was mostly becoming logical. From God will decide to let's maybe ask for evidence. A slow, painful upgrade. Eventually, across Europe and beyond, torture was outlawed, executions became rare and less public, and even peasants started gaining legal protections. Courts became places of law, not theatre. Judges wore wigs. Trials had rules. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Corruption, inequality, and weird laws still existed. And let's be honest, still do. but compared to the medieval mess of fire, blood, and let's see what God thinks, it was a monumental leap forward, and most importantly, you could finally go to court without needing to bring bandages. How not to survive a medieval castle siege. The sweet sound of birdsong, the gentle hum of the countryside, the distant scream of a terrified farmer as enemy troops set fire to his wheat. Wait, what? Welcome to Siege Day. It starts innocently enough. Maybe you're hauling a bucket of water. Maybe you're sweeping the keep. Or maybe you're just trying to enjoy your bowl of barley mush in peace. And then bam, a horn blares from the watchtower and chaos erupts. People scream, guards run, and the lord of the castle suddenly remembers he left the drawbridge down. Because today, my friend, is the day your medieval world gets a very rude wake-up call. An enemy army has shown up at your doorstep, and they didn't bring cookies. They brought siege towers, battering rams, and enough bad intentions to ruin everyone's weekend. Welcome to the medieval version of being locked in your office building, with no snacks, no escape, and an ever-increasing awareness that the interns are eyeing your shoes like they're made of jerky. So, what is a siege? A siege, in simple terms, is when a large group of angry, well-armed people surround your home, cut off all your supplies, and wait until everyone inside either starves, surrenders, or loses their mind. It's like an extremely aggressive HOA visit, except instead of asking you to trim your hedges, they're demanding unconditional surrender and your head on a stick. Siege warfare was the Middle Ages' favorite party trick. Why bother losing men in a risky all-out attack when you can just sit outside the castle for a few months and wait for the people inside to slowly unravel like a badly made wool tunic? And let's talk about that castle. Sure, it looks impressive. Big stone walls, iron portcullis, arrow slits. But let's not get cocky. That fortress is only as strong as the planning behind it, and judging by the smell coming from the courtyard, and the fact that nobody remembered to stockpile salt, this castle is about to become less fortress and more stone coffin with a nice view, locking in the madness. Once the alarm sounds, the gates shut, and when we say shut, we mean really shut. You're not popping out for a quick errand. The drawbridge is up, the gates are barred, and any door not sealed in iron is being barricaded with everything from furniture to terrified peasants. Even the side door the cook uses for dumping cabbage water gets a couple of armed guards and a bucket of boiling oil, just in case. Congratulations, you now live in a hermetically sealed pressure cooker filled with soldiers, townsfolk, and that one guy who coughs constantly but swears it's just allergies. Hope you like the smell of anxiety, because it's about to be the castle's signature fragrance, the population problem. You'll quickly notice that the castle is full, not just the usual residents, the noble family, their knights, their household staff, but everyone from the nearby village too. Farmers, bakers, shepherds, blacksmiths, their goats, their chickens, and that one guy who insists on bringing his prized turnip collection. The place is packed tighter than a sausage casing, and it only takes about 6 minutes for things to start feeling tense. You're elbow to elbow with strangers. Every stairwell is a traffic jam. Every hallway smells like stress and feet, and just when you thought it couldn't get worse, someone's baby starts crying on repeat. Welcome to the medieval siege experience. Maximum people, minimum personal space, instant panic. Just add army. The first day of a siege is a little like the first day of a really bad group vacation. No one knows what they're doing. Someone already lost the map, and half the group is crying. Soldiers rush to the walls, manning towers, loading ballistae, shouting instructions. Except no one can hear them over the sound of horses panicking and villagers screaming about their bread dough being left in the oven. The local priest is praying. The blacksmith is sharpening everything that can be sharpened. The cook is loudly discovering that the food stores are, quote, a bad joke, and you are realizing, with cold certainty, that you might have to ration your socks. The lord or lady of the castle is probably trying to look brave and composed, standing tall on the battlements in a flowing cape. But if you squint closely, you can see the raw, unfiltered terror in their eyes. The same look you'd have if someone just locked you inside your home and told you to wait while an army played drums outside. The unofficial agenda by the end of day one. A few things are certain. The gates are staying shut for a long time. No one planned well enough for this. You are now part of a terrifying social experiment in how fast people turn on each other when the toilets back up. This isn't just a military crisis, it's a survival show. Live, medieval, and featuring you as an unwilling contestant. There's no electricity, no hot meals, no privacy, and you're starting to think that boiled boot leather might actually be a viable snack option. And outside the walls, the enemy's just getting started. They've set up tents, they're measuring the distance to your walls, and they're already deciding which part of your castle they're going to smash first. They've got supplies, morale, and the luxury of not being stuck with medieval castle roommates who snore like a dying boar. Inside the walls you've got dwindling hope, a lot of hay, and the creeping realization that this siege isn't ending anytime soon. There's a sound every stomach makes when it's angry. It's somewhere between a growl and a whimper, like a wolf that's been emotionally neglected. Multiply that sound by a few hundred people, and you'll get the castle-wide soundtrack on day 3 of the siege. By this point, you've become intimately familiar with your own hunger, its mood swings, its favorite complaints, and its tendency to whisper things like, "That candle looks chewable. Let's rewind." When the gates slammed shut, and everyone poured into the castle like sardines with a death wish, someone, maybe the steward, maybe the cook, was supposed to have organized the food stores. Spoiler, they did not. Or rather, they tried, but they were preparing for a short siege, not a full-blown medieval staycation with starvation on the itinerary. On paper, the castle had enough food for about 2 months. In reality, once the chickens panicked, the flour sacks mysteriously vanished, and the pigs discovered how to escape. That number dropped to somewhere between "we'll make it" and "we'll be eating the curtains by Tuesday," and rationing. That noble-sounding concept quickly devolved into a brutal contest of who could sneak an extra scoop of porridge without getting stabbed with a spoon. Nobles get the good stuff, salted meats, dried fruits, even the occasional preserved fish. You get gruel, watery, tasteless, pitiful gruel. It's less a meal and more of an insult served warm. The first to suffer are the children and the elderly. They go quiet first, too weak to complain, too tired to care. Then the rest of the population starts to do the math in their heads. That sack of oats, it has to last 30 more days. Better water it down. That rat caught in the cellar, split it 4 ways. And before long, everyone becomes a master of culinary improvisation. Shoe leather, boiled moss, moldy roots. If it doesn't bite back, it's dinner. People get creative in terrifying ways. One man swears he's made a meat substitute out of old parchment and lard. Someone else suggests grinding bones into flour. No one dares ask what happened to the dogs. One day, there were 7 barking mutts in the courtyard. Now there's one. He doesn't bark anymore. He just watches you with quiet, judgmental eyes. By week 2, food becomes the only topic of conversation. Every dream is about banquets. Every argument starts over crumbs. You find yourself reminiscing about stale bread the way people talk about first loves. One peasant swears he once tasted a goose with cloves. Another starts crying because he once saw a plum. The psychological unraveling is swift. Hunger doesn't just make people weak, it makes them strange. Rational thought goes out the window. People begin hoarding things like dried herbs and boiled grass clippings, hiding them in boots or under hay mats. Suspicion festers like a wound. Who's sneaking extra food? Who's hiding something under their cloak? Who chewed the corner off the tapestry? You stop trusting people. You start thinking about pigeons differently. 1 minute, they're just flying rats. The next, they're potential kebabs with wings. Time stretches. You no longer measure days by the sun but by the meal schedule, which is a generous term for the part of the day where we pretend this soup has substance. Hunger gnaws at your ribs, yes, but also your dignity. A noblewoman once laughed when someone suggested boiling linen for broth. Yesterday she tried it herself. Today she's defending it like a family recipe. Eventually, chewing becomes a memory. Most food now is either too soft or too imaginary to require it. One man in the corner mumbles to himself about stew. He hasn't eaten in 2 days, but he keeps lifting his spoon and tasting air. No one interrupts him. They're too tired, too hungry, or maybe too jealous. And then there's the silence, the heavy, unbroken silence that settles in after mealtime. No one talks, no one jokes. The castle has gone hollow. Not just the walls, but the people. The guards lean on their spears with sunken eyes. The servants go through the motions like ghosts on autopilot. Hunger doesn't kill quickly. It strips you down layer by layer until even hope starts looking like a luxury. At first, you miss bread. Then you miss rats. Eventually, you miss chewing. Outside the walls, the enemy waits, well-fed, well-rested, and in no rush at all. Inside, you're not sure how long you can last. But you do know one thing, that candle still looks suspiciously like cheese. If you thought hunger was the worst part of a siege, let me gently redirect your attention to your nose. Because once the food situation starts to crumble, the second act of this medieval tragedy begins, and it's not pretty. In fact, it smells like someone boiled a sock in cabbage water, left it in the sun, and then added a generous splash of existential despair. Welcome to the medieval siege sanitation experience. A crash course in what happens when hundreds of humans are trapped together in a stone box with nowhere to poop. In theory, castles had a plan for this. Emphasis on theory. Enter the garderobe, a lovely medieval euphemism for hole in the wall that drops your business straight down the side of the castle. Some even had wooden seats. How fancy, but during a siege, not so much. Those garderobes were built for the regular castle population, not for the unwashed masses currently squeezing into every crevice, praying they don't sneeze and knock over a chicken. And worse, the castle's sewage system, if you can call it that, depends on gravity. Everything drops into cesspits or straight down the outer walls. Normally, rain and time wash it away. But remember, this is a siege. The enemy is camped outside, watching your every move. So now you're too scared to use the outer garde boobs, because a crossbow bolt might turn your bathroom break into a tragic ballad sung by peasants for generations. Solution: chamber pots, everywhere. In rooms, under beds, behind barrels, you name it. Someone's peed in it. And guess what? Those chamber pots have to go somewhere. With no access to the outside, the castle starts creating what we might generously call interior waste zones. Unofficial corners where the contents of chamber pots are dumped, covered with straw and ignored in the hope they disappear via magic or divine pity. Spoiler, they don't. By the end of week 1, the smell has gone from mildly offensive to outright confrontational. It follows you. It clings to your clothes, your hair, your soul. You start to feel like you are the smell. The stone walls, so excellent at keeping out arrows, are even better at trapping in odors. There is no breeze. There is no relief. There is only the hot, wet stench of a castle rapidly turning into a communal toilet. You might think you've found a clean spot, maybe a quiet corner near the chapel, or a tucked-away stairwell, but don't get too comfortable. Siege Rule #1. Don't stand under the toilet shaft. Siege Rule #2. There is no clean spot, anywhere. Desperation breeds innovation, and not the good kind. People start digging shallow waste pits inside the courtyard. Some try to hang makeshift buckets outside windows. One man constructs a portable relief bench out of wood and broken dreams. None of it helps. The waste builds, the flies come, and soon you're living in a latrine with battlements. The castle's animals aren't helping either. Goats, chickens, and the one surviving mule all add their generous contributions to the olfactory apocalypse. No one's cleaning it up. Why would they? The designated cleaners gave up around the same time the last bit of soap vanished, and no one wants to touch anything anymore. Even the rats are starting to look annoyed. And then there's the overflow. You don't talk about the overflow. You just wake up one night to the smell of something unholy wafting under your door. Someone screams, someone else retches, and now the hallway is flooded with more than just bad vibes. This is when people start bartering for dry straw like it's gold. Clean cloth becomes priceless. A handful of lavender from the herbalist's stash is considered high luxury. One noblewoman, normally the pinnacle of grace, starts rubbing dried mint on her upper lip like a mustache, just to mask the stench. Your dignity, gone. Privacy, non-existent. You share toilet space with people you wouldn't borrow salt from. And suddenly, the only thing worse than the constant hunger is the constant awareness of what's happening to all that watery soup. People are still somehow managing to eat. It's not just gross, it's dangerous. This much human waste in close quarters is a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery, typhus, and other delightfully medieval ailments start whispering through the ranks. People weaken, fevers rise, and you begin to understand why death by stink wasn't just a joke. it was a real possibility. So here you are, hungry, tired, and now living in a swirling cloud of airborne regret. You'd cry, but you're afraid it might attract the flies. There's something poetic about the moment hygiene finally gives up. It doesn't go out with a scream. It simply sighs, packs its things, and leaves through the same door that hope used 2 weeks ago. At first, people try. There are combs, cloths, prayers, but slowly, inevitably, the realization hits. In a medieval siege, cleanliness isn't next to godliness. It's somewhere closer to delusion. Let's start with the baths, or rather the total and complete absence of them. The medieval bathhouse might have once been a lively place, filled with buckets, hot stones, and awkward small talk. But now, the bathhouse is locked, the water barrels are dry, and the only thing getting wet these days is your sanity. Water, once taken for granted, is now too precious to waste on anything as frivolous as washing yourself. Every last drop is reserved for drinking, or possibly fighting over. If you want to freshen up, your options are stand in the courtyard and pray for rain. Rub yourself with a damp rag that's seen more tragedies than Shakespeare. Rebrand your filth as protective grime. By week 3, the concept of clean clothes is something people discuss wistfully, like long-lost love letters. You wear the same tunic for days, then weeks. Eventually, it stops being a garment and starts becoming part of your emotional support system. It smells like fear, sweat, despair, and something that might once have been soup, and yet you cling to it because the alternative is cold, nudity, and possibly lice migration. Ah yes, lice, the sieges, unofficial mascots. They don't care who you are, noble, servant, soldier, or goat herder. They will find your scalp, build tiny bug empires, and declare independence. Scratching becomes your full-time occupation. You scratch while eating, sleeping, weeping. You scratch places you didn't know could itch. Soon enough, everyone's got the look, eyes glazed over, fingers busy, hair tangled like battlefield shrubbery. But lice don't travel alone. Fleas show up too, hosting nightly blood-sucking banquets across the castle's population. They're particularly fond of the straw beds, which are now less bedding and more mobile plague units. Sharing is no longer caring. It's a public health hazard. And then there's the sweat. In a stone fortress, packed with hundreds of increasingly irritable people, things get moist. Airflow? Non-existent. Personal space? A fever dream. The communal atmosphere turns humid and sticky, like a badly ventilated barn. If the barn also served as a toilet and emotional breakdown center, your feet fare no better. Trench foot, that lovely condition where your toes slowly rot in damp filth, makes a surprise appearance, despite there being no trench. Turns out, all it needs is wet socks, cold air, and a general disregard for human well-being. Toes blacken, nails fall off. One man's heel squelches when he walks, and nobody knows why. No one wants to know. And let's not forget the smells. You're surrounded by them. Wall-to-wall stench. Every corridor has its own unique profile. Sour in the west wing, meaty in the main hall, mystery stew near the granary. The chapel smells like regret and mildew. The tower stairwell, best not described. You try to hold your breath, but with this many people packed in, the air already feels borrowed. It's not just the living making things worse. The dead are getting involved too. Bodies pile up, those who died from illness, despair, or unfortunate proximity to a latrine accident, with no way to bury them outside. Remember, you're surrounded by an enemy army. The corpses are stored, somewhere. A storeroom, a cellar, one particularly cursed broom closet. They're wrapped in cloth and prayed over. Sure, but cloth only does so much when the air smells like history's compost bin. You begin to envy the rats. They come and go as they please, weaving through the filth like smug little survival experts. They don't need shoes or baths or emotional boundaries. They don't cry when their socks disintegrate. They simply are. In a strange way, they're thriving, and that makes you angry. There's a moment, usually around day 20, when everyone stops pretending. No one comments on smells anymore. No one apologizes for being sticky or reeking of something unspeakable. You pass a neighbor and nod, as if to say, yes, I too have stopped feeling shame. This is siege life now. A grimy, itchy, pungent mess of humanity in full breakdown. Hygiene is no longer a habit. It's a memory. And if someone so much as mentions soap, the castle might riot. If you've ever had a bad roommate experience, multiply it by about 300, then subtract modern plumbing, personal boundaries, and any chance of escape. What you're left with is siege life inside a medieval castle. One massive, wheezing, overstuffed people box, where your elbow is always in someone's face, and someone else's foot is always in your stew. The thing about castles is, they weren't designed to hold this many people. In peacetime, a typical fortress might house a few dozen full-time residents. The lord's family, a handful of knights, servants, and some unlucky apprentice whose job is to mop up horse pee. But once a siege begins, suddenly it's a 5-star panic hotel. Every villager from the surrounding countryside pours in like they're fleeing a zombie apocalypse, which, to be fair, is not far off. The Great Hall, once a place for feasts and royal declarations, is now a massive sleepover gone wrong. Hay bales are turned into mattresses, wooden benches become beds, and the stone floor is fair game if you can fight off the chickens. If you're lucky, you get a spot near a wall. If you're not, you're in the middle of the room, surrounded by snores, body heat, and the sound of someone whispering secrets to their shoes. There is no privacy. None. You dress in public, sleep in public, cry in public, and possibly develop a very public rash. If you need to talk to someone in confidence, your only option is to lean in and whisper over the general roar of background discomfort. And even then, 3 other people are probably eavesdropping out of sheer boredom. The social structure collapses almost immediately. Nobles try to keep their distance at first, putting up curtains or fencing off little corners with broken furniture. But within days, those curtains are stolen for blankets, and the fences are knocked over by desperate parents looking for somewhere to put their screaming toddlers. It's chaos, but it's egalitarian chaos. Everyone is equally miserable, and in tight quarters, people get weird, very weird. The guy who used to bake bread in town now spends his days reciting poetry to a block of cheese. A group of teenagers has declared one alcove, the kingdom of Corneria, and is collecting tolls in the form of pickled onions. A monk claims he saw a vision in the fire, but it turns out he just inhaled too much smoke from a cooking fire, made out of furniture legs. The tension builds quickly. At first, everyone tries to be polite. People say sorry when they step on your face, or when they accidentally roll onto your leg in the night. But by week 2, manners have gone out the window, along with most of the furniture. Now it's elbows, curses, and the occasional passive-aggressive glare that says, "If you snore again, I will scream into a bucket." The worst part? The constant noise. Babies cry, dogs bark, someone's always singing off-key. At any given hour, someone is telling a story, arguing about turnips, or trying to remember how many toes they started the siege with. Sleep becomes a myth, something you read about once in a happier time. And just when you do doze off, your bedmate, the one muttering to his spoon, starts laughing in his sleep. Disease loves this setup. The moment someone coughs, you can practically see the plague playing hopscotch across the room. There's no airflow, no quarantine, and certainly no medical personnel who aren't already halfway to losing it. Illness spreads faster than gossip, which is saying something, because the rumour mill is working overtime. People whisper about poisoned wells, traitors in the keep, and whether the Lord's youngest son is actually hiding a secret stash of cheese. Arguments break out constantly, about food, about space, about someone stealing someone else's blanket and using it to build a personal throne. The guards try to keep order, but even they're fraying. One gets into a fistfight over a place near the fireplace. Another is caught trying to hoard dried peas in his helmet. Despite it all, strange friendships form. Misery is a bonding agent. You find yourself laughing at things that aren't funny, just because you need to laugh at something. One night, your bunkmates play a game using dried beans and bits of string. For 20 minutes, it almost feels normal. Then someone knocks over a chamber pot, and the illusion shatters like your last shred of mental stability. By this point, you've forgotten what personal space even felt like. You accept that your arm is someone else's pillow, and that every part of you smells like communal survival. You envy the rats, not just for their hygiene, but because they're free. They can run. You can't. You're trapped in a medieval social experiment with a few hundred of your closest strangers, and the spoon guy, he's starting to make sense. You wake up to the sound of something very large, slamming into something very old. Then comes the shouting, the screaming, the thunderous sound of stone on stone. and the unmistakable splatter of something wet landing somewhere it absolutely shouldn't. Congratulations. The enemy is not just outside your walls, they're actively trying to turn those walls into gravel. Siege warfare wasn't subtle, it wasn't clean, it wasn't quick. It was the medieval version of an extremely aggressive group chat, except instead of texts, you're receiving flaming barrels of tar, rotting animal carcasses, and the occasional plague-infested body lobbed directly into your courtyard, like a very personal screw you. Let's start with the king of all siege weapons, the trebuchet. This thing is not just a giant slingshot, it's the Renaissance equivalent of flipping a table in rage, but with physics. A well-made trebuchet could hurl a 200-pound rock over 300 yards with horrifying accuracy. Think of it as medieval artillery, but without the subtlety or the safety standards. You hear a distant clunk, thwop, hoo, roosh, and then a boulder smashes into your outer wall like it's auditioning for demolition duty. If they're feeling creative, they won't stop at rocks. Some attackers like to launch rotting animals, burning pitch barrels, or entire trees. You know, just to keep things interesting. And nothing says good morning like the sight of a diseased cow flying through the air and exploding into a fine mist of horror near the chapel. It's like breakfast theatre, except the main act is dysentery. Then there's the catapult, the trebuchet's less sophisticated, slightly drunk cousin, less powerful, less accurate, but perfectly capable of hurling chaos your way. Imagine trying to eat your sad little bowl of turnip soup while wood and flaming debris rain down like the world's worst weather forecast. It's loud, it's constant, and the vibrations shake the castle in ways that suggest the masonry is just as nervous as you are. Battering rams are another crowd pleaser. These hulking contraptions, often covered in wet hides to stop them from being set on fire, are wheeled up to your gates and smashed into them repeatedly, like someone forgot their house keys and really wants in. Every bang echoes through the keep. Every thud reminds you that your giant front door is basically a really stubborn piece of wood standing between you and total defeat. At some point, someone always asks, is that supposed to be bending like that? The answer is no, it's absolutely not. The siege tower, meanwhile, is just insult to injury. It's a mobile wooden fortress on wheels, slowly trundling toward your walls like a termite with ambition. Inside, it's filled with soldiers just itching to run up the ramps and pour over your battlements the moment they're close enough. Watching one approach is like seeing your own obituary being written in real time. You shoot arrows, you hurl rocks, you pray. It keeps rolling. All of this is happening while your defenders are desperately trying to fight back using whatever they have. Boiling oil gets dumped from the walls, archers loose volleys at anything that moves. Occasionally someone drops an anvil from a parapet, not because it's effective, because they're just out of better ideas. Of course, this is assuming the attackers don't dig tunnels under the walls in a tactic called sapping. You'll be sitting in the keep, minding your own business, when suddenly the floor starts to groan, and someone asks, why is the wall leaning? If you're really lucky, the enemy sets the tunnel on fire and collapses the wall from underneath. Surprise. By now, you've lost any ability to sleep normally. Every loud crack in the night might be the gate giving way. Every distant cheer might mean someone found a weak spot. You start to interpret every creak in the stone as a prelude to doom. Dreams become a chaotic mix of flying livestock, burning ladders, and a trebuchet that looks suspiciously like your mother-in-law. The noise is constant. Every hour brings a new barrage. You try to plug your ears with straw, but even muffled, the soundtrack of boom, crash, oh god, it's fire again plays on. You haven't had a peaceful moment in days. You drink water just to give your shaking hands something to do. At some point you wonder how the enemy hasn't run out of things to throw. The answer is, they planned for this. You didn't. They brought months of supplies, engineers, and endless siege equipment. You brought 3 sacks of barley and some questionable optimism. There's nothing quite like breakfast under a shower of fire and plague-soaked arrows to start your day. It's all very character building. If your character is a soot-covered insomniac with a nervous twitch and a deep mistrust of cows, there comes a point during a siege when the real enemy is no longer the army outside the walls. It's inside your own head. After weeks of hunger, stench, noise, and unrelenting fear, your brain begins to get creative. Rational thought packs up and leaves. Logic turns into folklore. Suddenly, that cracked stone in the courtyard is a bad omen. The wind in the chimney is whispering your name, and your bread crust has become your closest confidant. You're not alone, though. Everyone in the castle is unraveling, just at different speeds. The madness doesn't start with a scream. It starts with silence. People get quiet. They stop talking about when the siege ends. No more hopeful chatter, no more plans for rebuilding. They stare at the walls for hours, blinking like owls, clutching spoons like they're magical talismans. The cook begins humming the same 3 notes, over and over. The blacksmith is seen polishing a rock and calling it Gerald. Someone swears they saw a ghost in the chapel, but no one's sure if it was a ghost or just a very pale man looking for a private place to cry. Paranoia becomes the new castle hobby. Rumors swirl like smoke, thick, choking, and impossible to pin down. People whisper about spies inside the walls. Who's been talking to the enemy? Why does that one guard always disappear around the same time food goes missing? Why is Lady Eleanor's hair always so well brushed, huh? No one trusts anyone anymore. Someone sneezes, and the room clears, like he just announced he's the plague incarnate. You guard your rations like a dragon hoarding breadcrumbs. You sleep with one eye open, and your fork under your pillow. Not because you expect to use it for eating, but because it makes a decent self-defense weapon when your roommate starts muttering about taking back what's his. Religious hysteria takes hold too. One man insists the siege is punishment for the castle's collective sins. He takes to walking the halls in a sackcloth robe, flagellating himself with a rope made of old shoelaces. A group of desperate villagers gathers nightly to chant at the well, which they now believe is cursed. When a bucket comes up empty, they don't assume it was carelessness. They assume witchcraft. Someone suggests the rats are spies. No one argues. Then the hallucinations start. One woman claims she saw angels near the North Tower. Another man talks to a pigeon daily. He's named it Sir Charles and believes it's his spiritual advisor. You begin having full conversations with your last slice of bread. Its advice is questionable, but emotionally validating. Meanwhile, the line between survival and savagery gets thinner by the day. There are whispers, quiet, frantic, trembling whispers about missing people. Old Martin, who used to sleep near the fire pit, gone. No one remembers him leaving. That young boy who cried constantly, vanished overnight. Someone mentions cannibalism, and the room goes dead quiet. No one denies it. No one wants to know. Hunger and madness have become best friends. One man is caught boiling something in a pot that definitely did not used to be food. When questioned, he just grins and says, "Meats, meat." You avoid the pot. You avoid him. You avoid everything, really, except your corner, your crust of bread, and the one spot on the wall where the stone looks vaguely like a smiling face. The guards are no better. One of them keeps insisting he hears the walls talking. Another insists that victory is near, even though the enemy hasn't moved in days and the last message from outside came by arrow 3 weeks ago, and simply read, "Surrender, or else." The priest's sermons get stranger. One was just him standing silently for 15 minutes, staring into the fire, before announcing that God had left the building, and then sitting down. Eventually, someone breaks completely. There's a shouting match over a stolen turnip, and suddenly half the hall is in a brawl involving hair, chamber pots, and an improvised club made from a broom handle and dried fish. It ends in tears and apologies, but now no one feels safe. The atmosphere is electric with tension. Any loud sound makes people jump. Any shadow looks suspicious. The line between friend and threat is a blur. You cling to sanity however you can. Some people sing. Others count stones. One woman retells fairy tales using only vegetables. You keep talking to your bread crust. His name is Walter now. Walter understands. Walter listens. At this point, you're not even afraid of dying. You're afraid of spending one more day listening to Sir Charles the Pigeon give unsolicited life advice while the walls creak and someone sobs into their boots in the background. The siege hasn't broken the walls yet, but the people? Oh, they're cracked wide open. After weeks or months of filth, fire, famine, and Sir Charles the imaginary pigeon whispering sweet nothings into your ear. The siege is finally nearing its end, not because you're winning. No. It's just that something, somewhere, is finally going to give, and when it does, it's going to be messy, undignified, and probably involve someone shouting, "I told you not to trust the guy with the shovel." There's a cruel truth about medieval sieges. They almost never ended in glorious last stands or epic cavalry charges. Most ended with someone cracking, either the people inside the walls or the people outside them, and sometimes both simultaneously, like a horrifying historical piñata filled with plague and regret. One of the most creative ways things go sideways is tunneling. The enemy, likely growing bored of their flaming cow-hurling routine, decides it's time for some subterranean mischief. They dig under your walls with pickaxes, spades, and pure spite, hoping to collapse a section of the castle by undermining its foundation. It's called sapping, and it works more often than you'd like. So now, you're not just dealing with fireballs and psychological breakdowns, you're also listening to strange groaning noises beneath your feet, followed by the occasional suspicious vibration that makes everyone pause mid-bowl of rat stew. A chunk of wall drops off the main tower one day and crushes 2 barrels of barley, and the only man who still believed in optimism. In retaliation, your side, resourceful as ever, starts digging your own tunnels, but not for defense. No, you're digging toward the food storage room because someone locked it weeks ago, and no one remembers who has the key. The enemy tries to tunnel under your walls. You try to tunnel into the pantry. Neither works. Then comes disease. Oh, sweet, democratic disease. Dysentery makes a dramatic entrance like it's been waiting for its cue in the wings. One day, everyone has stomach cramps. The next, you're down 2 guards, 3 washerwomen, and an elderly nobleman who was using a mop as a cane. The latrines overflow. Again, the chapel smells faintly like despair, and something that was probably once soup. But the real killer isn't the disease itself. It's the way it tears through the already weak, sleep-deprived, underfed, spiritually crumbling human soup you call a castle population. The priest starts performing daily last rites in bulk. People stop asking what that smell is, because the answer is always, don't ask. Your castle's defenders, once proud and grim-faced, are now wheezing sacks of sadness, who'd surrender just to get access to a bar of soap and some ventilation. Then, when you least expect it, someone flips the table from the inside, because no matter how strong your walls are, nothing defeats stone faster than good old-fashioned human betrayal. It might be a desperate guard bribed with wine, and the promise of never having to eat boiled shoe again, or a minor noble with a grudge, a key, and poor impulse control. Maybe even the cook, who's had enough of everyone complaining about his squirrel stew. Whatever the reason, one night, a door creaks open. Just a crack. Just enough. And that's all it takes. The enemy pours in like ants at a picnic. Except these ants are heavily armed, and not interested in your emotional well-being. Alternatively, if no one gets bribed, and the walls hold, and the defenders are too delirious to notice the growing pile of dead, the siege ends the old-fashioned way. Everyone inside simply dies. The enemy waits, amused, until the silence inside is total. They walk through the front gates and find a castle filled with bodies, ruined furniture, and the faint echo of someone once yelling, "Don't eat the curtains." Of course, there are those famous few sieges where the defenders did win by sheer grit, divine intervention, or because the besiegers ran out of patience and snacks. In these cases, the enemy retreats, grumbling, and the survivors emerge, blinking into the sun, smelling like a compost heap, eyes wild, hearts hollow, but technically victorious. Yet even those wins come at a steep cost. Walls can be rebuilt, but the human psyche, not so much. The survivors look at each other and realize they've seen too much, done too much. One guy keeps speaking in rhyme, another can't stop hoarding turnips. You're still carrying on conversations with your bread crust. Walter's been through a lot with you, whether it ends in collapse, betrayal, plague, or an unexpected miracle. The siege never really ends. Sure, the gates might open, the enemy might vanish, but the trauma, oh, that sticks around, like lice or medieval guilt. So, you made it. The siege is over, the gates are open, the enemy is gone, or dead, or just bored enough to pack up and march off. Either way, the horns have stopped, the trebuchets are quiet, and no one has thrown a flaming pig at your castle in at least 3 hours. By all medieval metrics, this is technically a victory. But before you light that celebratory candle, which you'll need to scrape pigeon droppings off first, let's be clear, just because the siege is over doesn't mean you've won. Surviving is merely step one. What you're standing in now isn't a victory. It's a crater with curtain walls, and everything is ruined. Start with the obvious, the castle. The place looks like it's been personally insulted by every siege weapon in Europe. One tower is half missing. The main gate has more splinters than structure. The courtyard is littered with broken arrows, cracked stone, and what might be a wheelbarrow full of teeth. The well is contaminated. The food stores are empty, and the chapel has become a makeshift morgue, confessional, and snack closet, all at once. The great hall is now just hall. There's nothing great about it. The tapestries were burned for warmth. The benches have been broken for firewood. The once mighty high table is now being used as a shield for one extremely traumatized goat. You used to host banquets here. Now you just host trauma flashbacks. Let's talk about the people, or rather, what's left of them. Out of the hundreds who squeezed into the castle at the start, maybe half remain, and calling them alive is being generous. They've all got the 1,000-yard stare of people who've seen things no one should ever see. Like someone trying to turn a leather boot into soup. Everyone coughs, everyone limps, everyone smells like they lost an argument with a latrine. Infectious disease, meanwhile, is still holding court. Even with the siege lifted, the sickness doesn't just pack up and leave. No, dysentery, typhus, and friends decide to hang around a bit longer, just to see how many people they can take after the enemy's gone. Think of it as the siege's bonus round. And the food situation? Not great. The fields outside are torched. The livestock was either eaten, trampled, or now wanders the countryside as feral bacon. You'll have to wait until the next planting season to even think about recovery. Until then, you're on a strict diet of whatever didn't rot. And maybe this lichen won't kill us. Oh, and don't forget the rats. They've grown fat and cocky during the siege. They no longer run from humans. Some of them might be organizing. Honestly, at this point, if the rats start forming a local council, you'd vote for them. They've been more reliable than most nobles. Then there's the psychological wreckage. Everyone's mentally cooked. That guy who used to play the lute, he hasn't spoken in days. The blacksmith now only communicates in grunts and interpretive hammering. The woman who organized prayers during the siege has begun hoarding rocks. You tell yourself it's fine, but deep down you know you'll never trust a pigeon again. And then there's you, wobbly, emaciated, sunburnt, and still talking to Walter, the slightly mouldy bread crust who helped you through some dark moments. You think about starting over, but where would you even begin? The walls need rebuilding, the people need medicine, the crops need replanting, and you, well, you just want a bath, a nap, and possibly an exorcism. Worst of all, you realize something horrifying. This could happen again. There's nothing stopping another army from showing up next spring and deciding your ruined husk of a home looks like prime real estate. What then? Gather everyone and say, okay, let's do trauma. Round 2. No thanks. Which is why, for many medieval folks, surrender wasn't a dirty word. It was practical. Sure, handing over the keys might bruise your pride, but you might keep your walls intact, your people alive, and your furniture unburned. In a world where winning means limping through a plague-riddled wasteland with your dignity held together by rat string, surrender starts looking pretty noble. But you didn't surrender. You stuck it out. You survived. Congratulations. Now, enjoy rebuilding your life with rubble, trauma, and medieval PTSD. You've earned it. And if anyone ever asks what it was like, you'll just smile faintly, glance over at Walter, and whisper, you had to be there. So you survived a medieval castle siege. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you've been hallucinating this whole time, talking to a half-eaten onion and calling it Sir Crispington. Either way, let's pretend for a moment that you're one of the lucky ones still breathing, still standing, and only mildly emotionally unglued. Congratulations. You've just participated in one of the most unpleasant group experiences history has to offer. Now, in the spirit of closure and mild sarcasm, let's wrap things up with an absolutely useless yet deeply satisfying siege survival guide, featuring everything you should have done if you had the benefit of hindsight, superpowers, or a time machine. Step 1. Be the king. This is the most effective survival tip. Are you royalty? No? Well, that's your first mistake. Kings don't sleep next to rotting barrels of fish guts. Kings don't eat boiled rat. Kings get smuggled out of castles under cover of darkness while everyone else is left to fight over the last mouldy turnip. Your survival rate goes way up when your job includes a crown and a backup horse. Step 2. Leave before the siege starts. Once the enemy army starts pitching tents outside the castle walls, your options shrink faster than your food supply. The best time to escape was probably 3 days before that. The second best time is now, assuming you enjoy sprinting through arrows in the dark while dressed like a potato sack. Otherwise, enjoy your new indoor lifestyle forever. Step 3. Don't be born. During the Middle Ages, we cannot stress this enough. If you had simply chosen a timeline that included antibiotics, deodorant, and the concept of personal space, this whole siege thing would have been a fun history documentary. Instead of your personal smell-based apocalypse, mistakes were made. Most of them involve being born in a century where drinking water was a coin toss. Step 4. Befriend the rats. You'll see them more than your family. They know the castle better than the guards. They don't judge. Make peace with them early. Name them. Trade stories. One day, when all hope seems lost, your rat friends might lead you to a forgotten stash of stale oatcakes and spiritual clarity. Probably not, but it's good to dream. Step 5. Never trust a pigeon whisperer. If someone starts talking to birds, just walk away. This person is either mad, cursed, or 2 bad days from opening the gates to the enemy in exchange for a feathered prophecy. Pigeons are not to be trusted. They know things they shouldn't. Step 6. Invest in a really nice chamber pot. You might think this is low on the priority list. You'd be wrong. After 3 weeks of living like a human sardine, your chamber pot becomes your most cherished possession. Your throne, your confidant, your portable shame bucket. Choose wisely, etch your name on it, guard it with your life. Step 7. Become incredibly unappetizing. If things get truly desperate, you don't want to be the person someone glances at and thinks, I bet they'd roast up nicely. Your goal is to look stringy, unpleasant, possibly mildly poisonous. Talk to yourself a lot, rub dirt on your skin, eat weird herbs in public. When people are weighing who to eat next, you want them to skip you for the guy who still has his eyebrows. Step 8. Start digging a tunnel. Now, you might not make it far, you might just dig in a circle, but at least it gives you hope, a bit of exercise, and a temporary break from the smell of communal dread. Plus, if anyone asks, you can say you're restructuring the castle's wine cellar. No one has the energy to argue. Step 9. Cultivate a siege personality. By week 4, everyone knows who's who. There's the screaming guy, the soup whisperer, the one who collects bones, the weirdly cheerful optimist. Find your brand and commit. It's your ticket to surviving the madness with a hint of flair. Step 10. Invent pizza and live. Somewhere warm on it. Honestly, just skip the entire siege scenario. Move to the Mediterranean, plant some tomatoes, invent pizza, and enjoy your life. It'll take another 500 years for anyone to call you a genius, but you'll be eating hot, cheesy goodness instead of chewing your boot. Worth it. And there you have it. Your totally impractical, historically dubious, and emotionally necessary guide to surviving a medieval castle siege. Will any of this help? If you're trapped behind stone walls with no food, no hygiene, and way too many emotionally unstable neighbors, absolutely not. But if laughter is the best medicine, then maybe, just maybe, this guide will keep you going one more day. Or at least until you figure out whether that bread crust you've been talking to is actually just a piece of wood. Good luck, brave soul. You survived history. Now go lie down, stare at a cloud, and swear off castles forever. Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad, is the kind of monarch who makes even the most dysfunctional modern leaders look like well-oiled machines. His reign had everything: civil war, royal meltdowns, glass-based identity crises, and family drama that makes succession look like a tea party. Becoming king should be an exciting, majestic event, a celebration of destiny, divine right, and probably a pretty great buffet. Unless, of course, you're 11 years old, your uncles are vultures in velvet, and your country is broke, burning, and halfway through one of the longest, messiest wars in European history. Welcome to the childhood of Charles VI, future Glass King of France. Spoiler, it wasn't great. Charles was born in 1368, the son of King Charles V, an actually competent ruler who stabilized France after several rounds of English invasions, plague, and civil nonsense. Charles V was a clever guy, known as Charles the Wise, which in royal terms is basically a unicorn. He did things like reform the tax system, reduce corruption, and hire people who actually knew what they were doing. Naturally, fate decided that someone that competent couldn't stick around too long, so he died in 1380, when Charles VI was just 11. Cue the royal succession. Enter Charles VI. A kid barely tall enough to sit on a throne without swinging his legs like a bored toddler. Now burdened with running one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, France didn't just hand him a crown. They handed him a fire and said, "Try not to make it worse, since no one in their right mind lets a preteen run a kingdom. At least, not without deeply regretting it." A regency council was set up to guide young Charles until he came of age. Now, you might assume this council was made up of wise statesmen, experienced military leaders, and kind-hearted mentors who would nurture the boy into a capable monarch. You sweet, innocent soul. No, the Regency Council was made up of Charles's uncles, specifically the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, Anjou, and Bourbon, who saw the regency not as a sacred duty, but as a massive open bar of royal power. These guys looked at the treasury and said, yes, I'll have 3 chateaux, a cathedral, and whatever's left in gold bars. They taxed the people into oblivion, funneled money into their own pockets, and started hoarding land like it was medieval monopoly. France's already fragile finances began to crumble like stale baguettes, and just in case you thought these uncles were charming rogues with questionable morals, nope, they were incompetent, greedy, and often couldn't even agree with each other. Instead of addressing the actual problems of the country, like English armies stomping through French vineyards, they mostly argued, partied, and made sure the crown jewels had plenty of company at their personal residences. Meanwhile, Charles VI was growing up in this disaster stew. He was crowned king at Reims Cathedral at the age of 12, wearing a crown that probably weighed more than his torso. Ceremonial, yes. Symbolic, absolutely. Responsible leadership, not so much. There's a particularly poetic image in watching a child crowned with gold, while the kingdom beneath him drowns in debt and despair. And let's not forget the 100 Years' War still raging on in the background. England and France were locked in what was essentially a generations-long shouting match with swords. While the regents squabbled over wine money, English armies under kings like Edward III and the young hotshot Richard II were having a grand old time pillaging the French countryside. Entire regions were depopulated, trade collapsed, crops burned. French peasants got very familiar with the duck and hide strategy every time a foreign flag came over the hill. The people, oh, they were thrilled. If by thrilled you mean angry, starving, and deeply tired of watching their leaders use royal power like it was a casino voucher. There were riots in Paris, rebellions in the provinces. Even the nobles began side-eyeing the crown with thoughts of, maybe we try something else, like monarchy elite. Fewer taxes, less screaming. Charles VI was growing up in a palace. Yes, but one surrounded by the crumbling echoes of a once great nation. He was taught languages, history, swordplay, etiquette, everything a king needed, except perhaps the most important lesson: what to do when literally everyone in your life is looting the kingdom like it's a seasonal sale. By the time Charles hit his mid-teens, the regency ended, and he officially took over. Hooray! The boy king was finally going to fix everything. Right, not quite. The problem was, the damage had already been done. The treasury was a wreck. The war was still dragging on. His uncles were still lurking around the royal court like suspiciously overdressed raccoons. And Charles, well, Charles was just a young man trying to hold up a broken kingdom with the same energy most teenagers use to avoid chores. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, Charles VI is a boy with a crown too big, trapped in a royal system that sees him less as a leader and more as a glittery puppet. And the really fun stuff, hallucinations, screaming fits, and becoming one of history's most fascinating mental health case studies, is still a few chapters away. By the time Charles VI turned 21 in 1389, he had everything a medieval monarch could ask for: a crown, a realm in decline, the emotional stability of a damp baguette, and a royal court that was equal parts fashion show and political disaster. But for a brief, shimmering moment, it looked like he might actually steer France out of the gutter. After all, he was young, energetic, and by all accounts handsome enough to make the stained glass windows blush. Unfortunately, for every ounce of charm Charles possessed, His advisors had 2 ounces of incompetence, or in the case of France's most questionable power clique, the marmosets, pure political naivete, dressed in expensive fur. Let's talk about these guys. The marmosets weren't actual rodents, despite the unfortunate nickname, which loosely translates to little monkeys or marmosets. Not exactly the vibe you want for national leadership. They were a group of middle-class royal bureaucrats Charles liked and trusted because, get this, they actually wanted to govern well. Shocking, right? These weren't nobles, they were professional administrators, nerdy types who read accounting ledgers, proposed tax reforms, and didn't own a single gold-plated falcon. The marmosets were everything Charles's greedy uncles weren't: organized, reform-minded, and sober before noon. But here's the problem. In a medieval court, being competent is suspicious. The moment these guys started trying to clean up France's finances, reduce corruption, and curb the power of the high-ranking dukes, the dukes responded the way you'd expect spoiled aristocrats to, by grabbing their pitchforks made of silver and yelling treason. The moment Charles showed signs of independent thinking, his uncles collectively developed a sudden interest in advising again, which usually meant undoing anything remotely useful. Yet for a short window of time, Charles managed to hold off the ducal parasites and let the marmosets run the show, and things started to look better. Taxes were reformed. Some minor military successes happened. There were actual attempts to fix the crumbling bureaucracy, but the improvements were small and slow, and France was still a broke, battle-scarred mess, which is why Charles brilliantly decided the most logical thing to do next was host a massive royal party. Not just one party, mind you. Charles loved a good shindig. Festivals, processions, banquets with dishes shaped like swans performing backflips. If it involved trumpets, Charles was in. His coronation was a glittering affair, complete with elaborate dances, imported spices, and outfits so covered in jewels they could double as armor in a pinch. France might have been economically on fire, but Charles was out here inventing the medieval rave. In fact, the young king became famous for his fashion sense. If Charles had Instagram, it would have been filled with filtered selfies in velvet cloaks and fur-lined doublets, captioned #royal vibes. He popularized a trend called the hoppeland, a luxurious robe with wide sleeves and enough fabric to curtain an entire cathedral. Court life turned into an endless cycle of costume changes, pageantry, and increasingly expensive attempts to distract from the gaping hole in France's wallet. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, who we'll hear a lot more about later, matched him outfit for outfit. Together, they were the medieval Kardashians, glamorous, admired, and followed around by courtiers who alternated between flattery and quiet panic over the national debt. The treasury clerks were weeping into their ledgers, while the royal couple ordered another parade involving 20 white horses and a golden mechanical lion that could fart confetti. Okay, maybe not the lion, but admit it. You believed me for a second. Meanwhile, outside the glittering halls of Paris, things were considerably less sparkly. The 100 Years' War was still dragging on. The peasants were still starving. Local lords were still squabbling like drunk toddlers with swords, and every time the crown spent another 10,000 florins on a wine fountain shaped like Zeus, the population grumbled a little louder. But Charles, perhaps a little blinded by his youth, his beauty, and his excellent wardrobe, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he just didn't want to. After all, it's hard to think about national collapse when you're covered in ermine and dancing the carol under floating candle chandeliers. And yet, beneath the glitter, something was already beginning to crack. The pressures of the crown, the weight of the war, the constant tug-of-war between factions, it was all grinding away at Charles's mind. He didn't know it yet, but soon those long nights of music and feasting would give way to long months of hallucinations, confusion, and tragic outbursts. The boy who had once defied his uncles and dressed like the sun would slowly fade into a shadow of a man, convinced he was made of glass and terrified of being touched. But for now, Charles VI danced. France burned in the distance, and he danced anyway. On paper, the summer of 1392 started like a royal comeback story. Charles VI had just survived a rough few years of political tug-of-war court drama and tax-induced public grumbling. His advisors were back in their places, the royal glitter budget was running full steam, and the king, still young and glowing with that freshly powdered monarch energy, was ready to remind everyone that he was in charge. Naturally, the best way to show strength was with a military campaign. The plan was to march from Paris to Brittany, to punish a rebellious noble, Pierre de Cran, who had just attempted to murder one of the king's allies. The court was buzzing, the knights were sharpening their swords, the horses were getting dramatic braids in their manes. Charles, trying to be the king everyone wanted, geared up for the ride like a hero from a romance poem. But the deeper they rode into the forest of Le Marne, the closer they got to disaster. And I don't mean metaphorically. On August 5th, 1392, Charles was riding ahead of his army with a small group of knights, enjoying the peace and shade of the forest. The air was hot, the mood was tense, and the royal entourage was doing their best to look gallant while probably sweating through their chainmail. Then, it happened. A lone page, rushing behind them with a message, accidentally dropped his lance with a loud clang, a sharp sound in a quiet wood. Not exactly unusual in a medieval forest full of soldiers, but to Charles, it was the last straw. In an instant he froze in his saddle, his eyes went wide. Then, with the expression of a man who just realized all his friends are lizard people, Charles drew his sword and attacked his own knights. No warning, no explanation, just pure, screaming chaos. He lunged at one, shouting, "Traitors, you plot against me." He slashed at another, nearly cutting him down. The other knights scattered, unsure whether to fight back or try the medieval version of calm down, buddy. One poor man, unluckily close, got slashed in the face before managing to retreat behind a tree. Now, here's the thing about being attacked by a king. You can't really fight back. Royalty has this annoying habit of being above everyone else's pay grade, especially when they're swinging a sword at your head. So the knights did the only reasonable thing. They ran around yelling until someone tackled the king off his horse. After several sweaty minutes of dodging, ducking, and yelling, Charles was finally restrained. He collapsed, weaponless, on the forest floor, eyes glazed, mumbling nonsense. He had no idea where he was. He didn't recognize anyone. He couldn't even say his name. France. Meet your monarch. Confused, exhausted, and freshly violent. The army packed up the campaign right there and turned around. Because when your king suddenly goes full Shakespearean tragedy in the middle of a sunny forest, it's best to cancel the road trip. Back in Paris, the court went into damage control mode. They whispered words like possession, curse, and witchcraft. Physicians were summoned. Priests were called in to sprinkle holy water. The Queen was probably looking at the royal marriage contract, wondering if there was a return policy. Over the next few weeks, Charles drifted between brief periods of lucidity and long spells of confusion. He would forget who he was, where he was, and occasionally who other people were. At one point, he forgot he had children. At another, he forgot he was king. One report says he refused to bathe for months because he didn't believe he was a human being anymore. And yet, he looked fine. No fever, no wound, no obvious sign of injury. Just a perfectly healthy man having a complete meltdown. At first, everyone assumed this was a one-time freakout, maybe too much heat, bad wine, stress. But the royal doctors, who typically diagnosed everything from hiccups to death as imbalanced humours, had no idea what was wrong with him. Bloodletting didn't help. Neither did confession. One guy suggested trepanation, aka drilling a hole in the skull to let the demons out. Thankfully, that idea was shelved, probably by someone with a functioning frontal lobe. The scariest part? No one could predict when it would happen again. The king was like a royal jack-in-the-box, calm and composed 1 minute, full-blown sword-wielding maniac the next. The court grew silent. The Queen became permanently tense. Everyone who worked near the king started watching him, like he was a lit candle in a hayloft. But Charles? He had no memory of what he'd done. He woke up days later asking why they hadn't started the campaign. No one had the heart to tell him that the only people who got attacked were his own team. And so began the long unraveling of a monarch. The attack in the forest wasn't just a bad day, it was the curtain raiser for a lifetime of mental torment that would spiral far beyond the forest's edge. The court had to adjust. France had to adapt. And Charles, once the golden boy of the realm, would slowly become a ghost in his own palace. There are fragile kings, and then there's Charles VI, the monarch who genuinely believed he was made of glass. Not metaphorically, not as a poetic way to say, "I'm sensitive." No, He literally thought that if someone bumped into him the wrong way, he'd shatter into 1,000 royal shards like a cursed chandelier. Welcome to the strangest chapter of medieval psychiatry. The reign of a man who had the body of a king, the mind of a nervous antique vase, and the self-preservation instincts of a porcelain teacup on the edge of a shelf during an earthquake. The delusion started subtly. After his breakdown in the forest, Charles's mind never quite came back to its pre-sword swinging factory settings. He was occasionally lucid, but his memory and perception of reality were like soggy parchment, fragile, warped, and increasingly blank. Then, sometime in the early 1400s, he told his attendants something that made everyone in the room do a slow blink. He was made of glass. Not figuratively, not emotionally. No, he believed his body was literally composed of glass, and that if anyone touched him, or worse, if he fell, he would shatter completely, as in, sweep up his majesty with a dustpan shattered. This was a condition now known by modern psychologists as the glass delusion, and believe it or not, it wasn't entirely unheard of in the late Middle Ages. But Charles was its most famous, most royal sufferer. Naturally, this led to some adjustments at court. First, touching the king was out of the question. Courtiers who used to kneel and kiss the royal hand now stood at a safe, respectful distance, like Charles was a prized vase on a pedestal, labelled, "Do not tap." No hugs, no pats on the back, certainly no jousting demonstrations. Second, Charles ordered special clothing to be made. Rigid, reinforced garments designed to protect his delicate glass body. Imagine medieval armor, but for someone afraid of everything. Layers of padded fabric and stiffened leather turned the already heavily robed king into something between a walking mattress and an armored wine bottle. And walking? That was a whole new ordeal. Charles began to move gingerly, slowly, like each step might trigger a catastrophic shattering event. Servants were ordered to clear the hallways before he entered. Furniture was pushed aside, carpets were laid extra thick. Some sources suggest he even refused to sit for fear the pressure would cause a crack. His royal chambers may as well have been lined with bubble wrap and prayers. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate what this meant for the people around him. Imagine being a courtier, trying to bow deeply, while also mentally calculating how to do it without accidentally nudging His Majesty into imaginary oblivion. Try not to sneeze. Don't trip. Whatever you do, don't touch the king. You'd have better luck poking a bear. And yet, no one laughed. Not publicly, at least. Because even though this whole situation was absurd, even by royal standards, there was nothing funny about being locked in a palace with a monarch who could go from believing he was a glass statue to accusing his wife of being a demon to forgetting what day it was, all before dinner. Behind the silken ceremony, the court lived in fear. Not fear of Charles the man. He wasn't violent during his glass episodes, but fear of what his condition meant for the kingdom. Every time he cracked mentally, France cracked politically. If Charles was unwell, factions sprang up like mold. The dukes would sniff opportunity. The Queen would struggle to hold the regency, and the people would sigh and wonder if maybe England wasn't so bad after all. Meanwhile, doctors offered the usual brilliant medieval suggestions: burning incense, bleeding him with leeches, and praying a lot. One physician claimed Charles needed to wear rubies to balance his inner fire. Another suggested a change in diet, and by change in diet we mean boiled herbs that tasted like wet socks. Spoiler, none of it worked. Through it all, Charles remained a bizarre, tragic figure, sometimes calm and clear, other times convinced he was one tap away from becoming medieval confetti. At one point, he sat motionless for hours, fully convinced that any movement would cause him to shatter. Picture a room full of nervous courtiers whispering, "Do we feed him, or will the spoon be the final blow?" In the annals of royal madness, Charles's glass delusion stands out not just for how surreal it was, but for how symbolic it became. He was the literal embodiment of a kingdom that couldn't take another crack. France was at war, divided and bleeding money, and its king, delicate, beautiful, and tragically breakable. So yes, Charles VI believed he was made of glass, and honestly, for a man surrounded by enemies, betrayals, and the crumbling weight of a once mighty kingdom, it made a strange sort of sense. At first, Charles VI episodes were like unwelcome guests. You never knew when they'd show up, but you still held out hope they'd leave quickly. A few days of confusion here, a little royal sword swinging there, maybe a declaration that he was made of glass, normal king stuff. But by the early 1400s, the weirdness was no longer occasional. It was the new normal. The King of France had officially gone off the rails, and the court had box seats to the slow-motion train wreck. Charles's mental illness didn't follow any predictable pattern. Some days he was lucid, polite, regal, even insightful. Other days he wandered the halls, blank-faced and barefoot, mumbling nonsense to the curtains. Occasionally he entered periods of complete catatonia, sitting motionless for hours, staring into the medieval middle distance, as if trying to remember where he put his soul. And sometimes he'd forget everything: his name, his wife, that he was king, or even where he was. It wasn't just losing his train of thought. It was like the entire railroad disappeared. The palace became a chaotic game of which Charles will we get today? Would it be Charles the lucid, who could hold court and make decent decisions? Charles the forgetful, who had to be reminded not to eat with his hands? Or Charles the mad, who thought he was St. George and tried to bless people with his sword? It kept everyone on edge. Ministers whispered in corners. Servants tread softly. Even the Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, who had married the handsome, healthy version of Charles, now had to rule in his place, while he tried to convince a candle holder that it was a courtier plotting against him. And the hallucinations, oh boy, they were the stuff of legends. Charles saw enemies lurking in shadows, claimed strangers were his long-dead ancestors, and once insisted he was being pursued by invisible enemies. There were even moments where he couldn't recognize his own children, which, let's be honest, is one way to get out of birthday presents. Naturally, the court tried everything to cure him. Step 1. Religion. Relics were paraded into his chambers like it was a holy fashion show. Splinters of the true cross, bones of saints, and enough holy water to drown a demon were all brought in. Monks chanted, priests prayed. Nothing happened, except Charles once mistook a bishop for a demon and threw a candlestick at him. 10 points for enthusiasm, 0 for accuracy. Step 2. Medicine. Well, medieval medicine, which is basically the same as throwing herbs at a problem and hoping the moon is feeling generous. They bled him. They applied leeches. They tried cooling tonics, balancing diets, and things that sounded less like treatment and more like medieval cocktail experiments. Charles still had episodes. The only thing the leeches helped was the royal mosquito population. Step 3. Screaming. When all else failed, someone got the brilliant idea to just yell at him. The theory was that maybe they could shock him back to reality. Yes, someone in the court thought what Charles needed wasn't therapy, but aggressive shouting. Unsurprisingly, this led to more confusion and a mild stabbing incident involving a decorative fork. Meanwhile, France, the actual country he was supposed to be ruling, was crumbling faster than a stale croissant. With the king mentally absent, factions formed like mold on brie. The Queen and the Duke of Orleans, Charles's brother, tried to hold things together, while the powerful Duke of Burgundy sharpened his political knives. Everyone wanted control, but no one wanted the blame. And still, Charles sat in the middle of it all, sometimes lucid enough to nod at a treaty, other times lost in a fog where he couldn't remember if he was married or made of fire. During one infamous episode, he refused to bathe or change clothes for months, convinced that anyone touching him would curse him. He developed violent mood swings, alternating between manic laughter and sobbing fits. Once he ran through the palace screaming that enemies were coming, only to hide in a fireplace for the better part of an afternoon. But perhaps the most haunting moment came when, during a rare moment of clarity, Charles reportedly broke down and asked, "What have I done wrong, that God punishes me so?" A tragic, lucid question from a man whose own mind was his prison. The court, for all its flaws, didn't laugh. They couldn't afford to. The king wasn't just a ruler, he was a symbol, and symbols can't be mad. So they tiptoed, they lied, they smiled, they did whatever it took to keep up appearances, while the man at the top lost himself one piece at a time. One day, he thought he wasn't king. Another, he thought he had two heads, and yet, remarkably, through it all, he was still somehow more functional than half the people trying to run France in his name. While Charles VI was busy debating with drapes and occasionally forgetting he had bones, the rest of France was experiencing its own brand of madness, a full-blown civil war in silk gloves and steel daggers. With the king mentally checked out like a royal guest at the Hotel Delusion, The throne was no longer a seat of power. It was a throne-shaped vacuum. And as history consistently teaches us, power vacuums never stay empty for long. Enter the two biggest players in this royal tug-of-war, Louis, Duke of Orleans, and John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. If these names sound dignified and regal, don't be fooled. They were more like the real housewives of medieval France, but with fewer wine glasses and more mercenary armies. Louis of Orleans was Charles's younger brother, which meant he had royal blood, a dramatic flair, and a tendency to insert himself into everything. During Charles's off days, which was becoming most days, Louis acted as de facto ruler, making decisions, signing documents, and building a solid reputation as that guy who throws very expensive parties while the kingdom is in flames. He was charming, fashionable, and fond of affairs, as in, lots of them. One particularly scandalous rumour suggests he even had a bit too much affection for Queen Isabeau, his sister-in-law. Yes, France was burning, and Louis was busy possibly inventing medieval soap operas. Then there was John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, who lived up to his name. Provided fearless means aggressively ambitious and ready to backstab someone over cheese. John wasn't just Charles's cousin, he was also one of the most powerful landowners in Europe, commanding massive wealth and an even more massive ego. Where Louis was decadent and flashy, John was cold, calculating, and just a little murdery. Both men claimed they were doing what was best for France, and by best, they meant convenient for me and my buddies. As Charles spiraled further into madness, the royal court turned into a battleground. Not with swords, not yet, but with whispers, bribes, and aggressively pointed side-eyes across banquet tables. This wasn't politics. It was a turf war in velvet leggings. The kingdom quickly divided. On one side, the Orleanist supporters of Louis swanned around with scented gloves and too much eyeliner. On the other, the Burgundians followers of John stomped around Paris with matching liveries and an enthusiasm for order that usually meant punching their enemies in the face. Each side built up its own army, fortified towns, and started accusing the other of everything from embezzlement to sorcery to ruining the wine harvest. Things reached their boiling point in 1407. That's when John the Fearless decided he was done playing chess and was ready for checkmate. So, naturally, he had Louis of Orleans assassinated in the street. No cloak and dagger subtlety here, just a bunch of thugs with axes who jumped Louis on a dark Paris street and hacked him to pieces. John's response when asked about it: basically, yeah, I did it, you're welcome. He was corrupt, which, in medieval PR terms, is what we'd now call a bold strategy. Shockingly, instead of causing the nobility to gasp and unite in horror, this just escalated the chaos. Now the Orleanist faction, led by Louis's son Charles of Orleans, wanted blood. The civil war that had been brewing finally boiled over into open conflict, and France, already weakened by the 100 Years' War, now found itself at war with itself. Meanwhile, poor Charles VI, the king, remember him, was sitting in the middle of all this, probably asking his reflection if it was plotting against him. He had no idea his brother was dead. He certainly wasn't making any decisions. In fact, during key moments, he was so detached that courtiers would just prop him up, nod along with his ramblings, and sign treaties in his name. France didn't have a monarch. It had a puppet with very expensive delusions. As the civil war intensified, towns declared loyalty to one duke or the other. Armies marched through the countryside. Peasants were caught in the middle, because what's medieval France without another round of taxes, famine, and flaming pitchforks? Trade routes collapsed. Law and order dissolved. Local nobles started doing whatever they pleased, like warlords at a Renaissance fair. And yet, the palace pretended everything was fine. Feasts continued. Protocols were followed. The royal family posed for paintings while the kingdom slipped into anarchy just beyond the garden hedges. One ambassador described the French court as a fine mirror with no reflection, beautiful, hollow, and completely useless. By now everyone knew the truth. Charles VI wasn't coming back. Not really. Even in his lucid phases, he couldn't make decisions without doubting his own existence by desert. The real power belonged to the factions, and they were more interested in slapping each other with declarations than solving anything. So to recap, the king was hallucinating. The queen was caught in political crossfire. One duke was murdered. The other was polishing his armor. And the French people, they were just hoping someone anyone would remember how to rule a kingdom without setting it on fire from both ends. By now, the French monarchy was less a functioning institution and more of a high-stakes game of medieval Jenga. And guess what? Somebody just pulled out a key block and then set the tower on fire for good measure. The year was 1407, and France was balancing on a blade. King Charles VI was mentally adrift, sometimes believing he was invisible, sometimes convinced he was glass, and always completely useless when it came to running the kingdom. He was essentially an expensive, well-dressed placeholder with a crown and a very confused face. So naturally, someone had to step up. That someone had once been Louis of Orleans, the king's younger brother, who had taken a very enthusiastic approach to being the power behind the throne. He made decisions. He spent enormous amounts of money. He whispered sweet nothings, possibly literally, into the ear of Queen Isabeau. And more importantly, he infuriated John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. John the Fearless was the kind of man who treated patience like a disease. If he wanted something, he went for it. And what he wanted now was total control over France, but Louis was in the way. So John, naturally, ordered a little medieval problem-solving. Hire 15 guys with axes and kill your rival in the street. Voila! On a chilly November evening in Paris, Louis was making his usual smug stroll back from visiting Queen Isabeau, purely political of course. Wink wink, when a gang of hired thugs jumped out from a doorway and hacked him to death. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't clean. It was medieval murder, with all the finesse of a dropped ham. John didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed weirdly proud of it. He claimed it was justified tyrannicide. The justification: Louis was corrupt, manipulative, and a danger to France. Which may have been true, but it's still a bold move to assassinate the king's brother, and expect a thank you note. And where was King Charles during all this? Probably staring out a window, and wondering whether the moon was looking at him funny. When he was finally told about the murder, during one of his lucid episodes, he reportedly collapsed in grief. His brother was dead, his kingdom was falling apart, and the only thing he could clearly identify was that none of this was going well. But Queen Isabeau, she didn't get to collapse. She didn't get to cry. She had to hold the entire burning mess together with the medieval equivalent of duct tape and gritted teeth. Isabeau of Bavaria has been historically smeared as everything from a schemer to a seductress to a politically clueless shopaholic. But let's be real, the woman was married to a king who thought he was invisible and had to manage a country that was actually splitting in two. She was at worst deeply overqualified for disaster management. After Louis's death, she tried to be the glue that held the royal court together. She negotiated, she pleaded, she played both sides when necessary, and while the men around her were stabbing each other, literally and metaphorically, Isabeau was trying to keep the French crown from sliding off a cliff. She worked to protect her children, especially the Dauphin, the heir to the throne, who was suddenly a hot commodity in the political marriage market. Everyone wanted to control him, marry him off, or use him as a royal chess piece. Meanwhile, John the Fearless was gaining momentum. He took over Paris, claimed he was acting in the king's interest, and started issuing proclamations like France was already his. The court, terrified and directionless, splintered. The Orleanist faction, now led by Louis's son, who was barely out of short pants, wanted vengeance. The Burgundians wanted control. The Queen wanted peace, or at least less stabbing. And Charles believed he was invisible. Truly, at one point during this phase of his illness, he was convinced he couldn't be seen. He would sit silently in rooms, refusing to speak, insisting people couldn't see or hear him. It would have been comical if it weren't so tragic. Here was the King of France, the man literally born to rule, completely convinced he had vanished from existence. And judging by how everyone was ignoring his authority, he kind of had. This is where we hit what historians politely refer to as the low point. The monarch was incapacitated. The Queen was desperately brokering peace, while being accused of sleeping with half the nobility. One powerful duke was dead, another was sharpening his metaphorical knives, and the country had split into two political camps more hostile to each other than to the actual English. Charles thought he was invisible. His enemies acted like he was too. And France was standing ankle-deep in the blood of its own ruling family, staring into the abyss of full-on civil war. If there was a rock bottom for the French monarchy, this was it. And sadly, no one had invented therapy, group counseling, or even a basic group hug. All they had were swords, pamphlets, accusations, and a royal figurehead who believed his reflection was conspiring against him. If medieval kings were judged by how much territory they conquered, how many laws they passed, or how many cathedrals they slapped their names on, then Charles VI of France wouldn't just be near the bottom of the list, he'd be clinging to the edge of the parchment like a sad footnote. And yet, his reign, if we can call it that, lasted over 4 decades. That's not a short stint, that's a career, a tenure, a royal marathon. The only problem? He was mentally present for maybe 10 years of it. The rest? Well, France got ruled by a man who was either talking to chairs, staring at ghosts, or convinced he didn't exist. But let's rewind to the late stages of this crown-shaped catastrophe. By the 1420s, Charles had almost completely faded from reality. Once the golden boy of France, the handsome, dancing, velvet-draped monarch, had become a whisper of a man. He barely spoke. He rarely recognized people, even his wife and children. He no longer believed he was made of glass, but mostly because he'd forgotten what glass was. He drifted silently through his own court, like a medieval phantom, occasionally blinking at courtiers who smiled just a bit too tightly. France, meanwhile, was doing worse than Charles, which is saying something. With the king effectively a royal houseplant, power had fractured into a nightmarish patchwork of squabbling factions, murderous nobles, and opportunistic Englishmen, rubbing their hands like cartoon villains. Then came the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, arguably the single worst political decision ever signed by someone who still technically wore a crown. Here's the setup. The 100 Years' War was still on like an endless, badly scripted medieval soap opera. England was back in the picture, led by Henry V, who had charisma, military skill, and none of the mental fragility of Charles. After a series of military victories, including the Battle of Agincourt, where English longbows made French knights look like confused bowling pins, Henry was in a very strong negotiating position. Queen Isabeau, exhausted, politically cornered, and likely desperate to avoid more civil war, signed the Treaty of Troyes, declaring that Henry V would inherit the French throne after Charles's death. That's right, Charles's own son, the Dauphin Charles, later Charles VII, was disinherited, completely cut out of the royal family tree, like a dead branch. This move was outrageous, treasonous, even, but Charles said nothing. Not because he approved, not because he disagreed, because he was too far gone to understand what was happening. One report says he simply nodded, then asked if the candles were whispering again. The King of France had officially become a silent bystander to the dismantling of his own dynasty. To make matters worse, because why stop the disaster train now? Henry the Fad and Charles's daughter, Catherine de Valois, were married, sealing the deal. The king, who couldn't remember his own name, had just become father-in-law to the man who planned to take his job. But fate had one last twist left. Henry Vad, seemingly immortal in battle, suddenly died of dysentery in 1422. 2 months later, Charles VI also died, quietly, without ceremony, like a man slipping out of a dream he barely remembered being in. And so, in one of history's more ridiculous succession crises, Charles VI of France was succeeded not by his own son, but by his infant grandson, Henry VI of England, a baby who couldn't walk yet, let alone rule 2 countries, because nothing says strong central authority like a war-torn kingdom handed to a drooling toddler in a bonnet. So what was Charles VI's legacy? He ruled for over 40 years. He was lucid for a fraction of them. He presided over one of the most chaotic eras in French history, during which France was nearly carved up like a roast duck at a royal banquet. His brother was murdered. His cousin tried to become king. His queen signed away the crown. And his mind, poor thing, just sort of gave up and left the building. And yet, people still mourned him, because despite all the chaos, the madness, the glass delusions and the long silences, Charles was not cruel. He wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't greedy. He wasn't even stupid. He was sick. Tragically, helplessly sick. And many people saw that. His courtiers tiptoed out of compassion. His wife, despite all the rumours, stayed in the political trenches for years trying to protect what remained of the monarchy. His people, ravaged by war, famine, and crushing taxes, still called him Charles the Beloved, Maybe that was out of pity, maybe out of respect, or maybe because they knew, deep down, that France's true tragedy wasn't a mad king. It was the world that built no safety net for him. So yes, Charles VI ruled for 40-odd years, and yes, for most of them, he was ruled by hallucinations, paranoia, and crippling mental illness. But he became a symbol of fragility, of a kingdom breaking with its king, and of how even the most gilded crown can't hold a shattered mind together. And in the most poetic twist of all, his son, the disinherited Dauphin, would later rise from political obscurity with the help of a peasant girl named Joan of Arc, and reclaim the throne for France. But that's another story. Charles VI, the Glass King, had finally cracked, and yet somehow France didn't completely fall apart, not for lack of trying.